to the Symposium on AI in Learning Health Systems pre-symposium. We're so glad you could be here with us today. We were hoping that we would see you in April in Bermuda. We are hoping still that we will see you in Bermuda a year from now in October of 2021. Watch this space for more information on the face-to-face we look forward to. For now, we're so excited to be here today to bring you a panel of experts in the area of AI and learning health systems. And we wanted to explain how SAIL came about, that there are so many communities working on different aspects of this space. And we really wanted to bring together not just clinicians and specialists in AI, but also clinical informatics experts, people really doing the on-the-ground work. We wanted to emphasize this is not a dress rehearsal. AI is impacting the clinic today, and we wanted to have a symposium and a forum to present the really exciting things going on today, what some of the obstacles are, bring together some of the greatest minds in this space to talk about how we are tackling those obstacles and what the future is looking like. We have 3 panels for you today. We'll be looking at how to evaluate AI, some of the frontiers in AI in the clinic, and how to frame this so that we can move forward in the most effective way. We want to most importantly thank our sponsors, the New England Journal of Medicine, United Health Group, and Apple, without whom none of this would be possible. And we look forward to seeing you in October in the fall, and I'm very excited to hear the discussions today. And with that, I will turn you over to your host for today, Dr. Nick Tatanetti. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jesse, for the great introduction. I'm super excited to be with you today. My name is Nicholas Tatanetti, and I'll be helping you escort you through today's events. Without further ado, let's jump right into panel 1. I'm going to turn it over to our moderator for panel 1, Jason Moore, Edward Rose Professor of Informatics and the Director of the Penn Institute for Biomedical Informatics. Jason, take it away.
Hello, my name is Jason Moore. I'm a professor of informatics and director of the Institute for Biomedical Informatics at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm moderating this panel on the challenges and opportunities for using artificial intelligence solutions at the point of care with a focus on the adoption, evaluation, and vetting process. Our panelists today are Drs. Michael Abramoff, Marzia Gassimi, Maya Hightower, and Isaac Kohani. Let's start with Dr. Hightower. Please introduce yourself and then share your thoughts about the evaluation and vetting of AI for deployment at the point of care.
Thank you. My name is Maya Hightower. I'm the Chief Medical Information Officer at the University of Utah Health. I'm also a practicing internist. And my teams, we span a wide variety of teams, including the data warehouse, informatics, knowledge management mobility solutions, as well as digital health. And the University of Utah, we're very fortunate to have a really long history of biomedical informatics within our institution. And so we have a nice, strong relationship with BMI and are able to leverage the expertise within our institution to make good decisions, or better decisions than I think we would be able to otherwise. And so specifically on how we evaluate AI, I think we have a really good process for evaluating AI when it comes to commercial AI products. The history of healthcare IT and the ability to evaluate information technology has really evolved. And so we have a robust process that really focuses on the amount of value an investment brings to our institution, how it aligns with our strategic plan, and a scoring rubric that matches. So generally, when it comes to AI that is commercially available, a good example would be from our colleague here, Dr. Abramoff has a product that we invest in, or that we are customers of. We often will rely on the vendor when it comes to actually vetting the AI, and the process, though, goes through our traditional application advisory committee and like IT evaluation process. One area where we could use a lot more help is when we have self-developed AI solutions, and we have really robust, technical, talented people that are able to answer or really delve into the data and come up with algorithms. And we don't have a good, robust way to assess those algorithms other than the standard process. So we don't have a third party that we can rely on that has done their due diligence like an FDA-approved AI embedded solution.
Thank you very much. Let's turn to Dr. Abramoff. Please introduce yourself and share your thoughts about the evaluation process for AI.
Hi there, thanks so much. My name is Michael Abramoff. I'm a professor of ophthalmology and visual sciences at Iowa. I'm also a professor of electrical and computer engineering, as well as biomedical engineering at the same university. I'm also founder and executive chairman of Digital Diagnostics, formerly known as IDX, which created the first ever autonomous AI approved by FDA. I love what Maya just said, because I will get back to that, but there's a lot of focus right now starting on self-developed rather than FDA-regulated AI. But first, let me say that anytime you want to use AI to improve patient outcome, you work your way back from how do I get this to patients? There needs to be an ethical framework that works and that is credible. So you get into bias, racial and ethnic bias, as well as what is the AI compared to? Is it compared to a physician or maybe outcome? How do you design the AI? Can it be a black box? Lots of aspects. And so you essentially work your way back to, well, what was the FDA and what do we want to see in terms of proof? Should it be a randomized clinical trial or should it be a cohort trial? Or can we just observe in the real world? So getting back from patient outcome and this benefiting patients all the way to all these frameworks we're discussing is sort of a number of steps you need to take, and ethics of course plays a big role. And then back to what Maya said was very exciting. There's actually FDA and we have together created a so-called collaborative community where we're creating best practices for AI, including autonomous AI, and it also includes not only commercially available, right, where FDA regulates what you can say in terms of your marketing claims, but also outside when it's, for example, self-developed within the healthcare system and is never marketed. And so I'm very glad to say that the Federal Trade Commission is now involved with so-called, it's a long title, Foundational Principles of AI or Algorithmic Interpretation. And the Federal Trade Commission is now a member to essentially see what's going on there, because for the Federal Trade Commission has a much broader mandate than the FDA. They can literally look at anything that has to do with consumer safety, including patient safety. So how it's going to roll out is currently being discussed, but certainly we need to answer these things to make sure that there's no backlash to the use of AI. What I worry about is that if we don't play this right, if we cut corners, if we do it unethically, people will say enough of this, too many people getting killed or harmed. We need to stop doing this, and for 20 years we won't be doing it. And of course, there's so many advantages, which is the reason we're discussing it here. So we'll stop here.
Well, let's turn to Dr. Kohani. Could you introduce yourself and maybe share some of your thoughts about bias and the evaluation process in general?
Sure. My name is Isaac Kohane. I'm a professor of biomedical informatics at Harvard Medical School. I trained in pediatric endocrinology and got a PhD in computer science, working in artificial intelligence during the second heyday of artificial intelligence in medicine, after which we all had a very unfortunate experience of the AI winter. I'm much more optimistic in this third heyday of artificial intelligence, partly because we are having the conversation that we're having. Now, there will be some unevenness, but Dr. Abramoff is pointing out how you can actually engineer to make sure that your claims are appropriate. And that's all well and good. In practice, I think it's going, for the near future, there's so much room for improvement that I'm not worried about it. But going down into the future, I am going to become increasingly worried for a number of reasons. One is Dr. Abramoff says we should not be looking at what we think is the right measure. We should be looking at outcomes. Well, we're not very good at looking at outcomes because the systematized capture of outcomes, whether in trials or in EHRs, is noisy, confounded. It's a great research agenda, but I am not confident that that it's the right thing to do this day. And many, if not all, the AI programs that are going to be deployed in the next 10 years will be poor with respect to outcomes and rich with respect to either human labels or intermediate process measures. And so therefore, the gold standard that might keep us away from doing the wrong thing will be problematic. I'm also worried because FDA is doing great and creative things, as Dr. Abramson has articulated. But what it does is it says this is safe to a given standard. What it doesn't do is say this is better than the other product. And lest you think that this is an abstract concern, they are now commercially available two $6,000 cell-free liquid biopsies to predict or detect cancer recurrence in individuals based on their blood. Publication in JAMA Oncology in the last year showed that these algorithms based on these liquid biopsies both disagreed about the facts, the mutations, and the recommendations 50% of the time. 50% diametrically opposite recommendations, yet both were FDA approved. So FDA is not doing the consumer reports function. And I think that it's very sad comment that we are going to have less knowledge about which test to pick, which AI algorithm to adopt, than we have in buying a refrigerator or a mattress, where they're compared one for the other to actually deliver the efficacy that we're looking for. And so I think that is, so the absence of the consumer reports function is absolutely essential. I am confident, because there'll be such a great need, that there will be a market function that generates it, but it's not there today.
Great, thank you. Let's turn to Dr. Gassimi. Please introduce yourself and share with us your perspective on putting AI in the clinic.
Hi, my name is Dr. Marzia Gassimi. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Toronto in computer science and medicine. I'll be moving to MIT to join the IMES and ECS departments next summer. I am currently holding a Canadian CFAR AI chair and a Canada Research Chair, and I'm one of MIT's 35 under 35 innovators a couple of years ago. The things that I think are most important from a computer science machine learning point of view for deployments are that all deployments really have to consider that these things are trained based on real data and practice. And so data is very biased and practice is also very biased. So in these settings, anything that you observe in data or practice could then be automated in a deployment.
Okay, can I respond to that?
Yep.
And so there's validation and there is development, right? I think if you're conscious of the biases you're creating, and that's a big if, you can sort of deal with that. If you validate against current practice, then you will never go beyond your bias. So that's why I think it's so important to look at outcome. So if you validate against outcome, at least you get rid of that, because it's literally about the best outcome for that patient, however valued. So I do want to split validation versus development, which I think are two different things.
Those are very entangled, though, especially in clinical care, right? So look at the sources of data that you often have access to in order to validate an algorithm, right? The FDA didn't say that women had to be included in like all stages of, drug development until very recently. All of the data that we have in clinical trials has been shown time and time again to be very, very biased, right? Often it doesn't have a diverse group of people. You don't have to, when you get a medical device, FDA approved, demonstrate that it works on black skin. There's a reason that those SpO2 monitors weren't working so well initially when COVID hit on some populations. And so I would say, yes, validation and deployment are often different things, but we don't always think about how baked in the bias is at every step of thinking about research questions, what research teams are going to look at them, what gets funded, what kind of data you get to collect, what kind of outcomes you're going to study.
And then we build the algorithm based on all of these really, really biased structures that we already exist. And on the algorithmic side, even simple choices like optimizing towards a mean instead of a median mean that black faces, when you pixelate them, get imputed to be white. That's the mean, and that was your loss function. And so I think these kinds of incredibly complex questions, there's no way to think about all of them ahead of time. And so this is why I think that the way we validate is so entangled with how a deployment might go, because even if you think about many, many things ahead of time, if you deploy into a setting that by chance you didn't happen to have some idea might have a wrinkle of a sort, you're going to bias yourself against performing fairly in those populations.
I just want to know, how then can we debias our systems? I mean, I know that it's a really complex problem, and we're trying to create a framework by which we debias not only our algorithms, our data products, but as well our approach to IT solutions in general, so that we obtain the greatest value for all of our patients equitably across, and ensuring that we're decreasing the barriers to access. I mean, digital health, I know that's a tangent, but that, when we think about even as we're communicating today with Zoom, digital health is a divide that's perpetuating inequities within healthcare. So, I mean, how do we debias our algorithms?
I'm going to argue that maybe we don't always want to debias. And sometimes bias is actually medically constructive. Let me give you an example. We're right now in the middle of this COVID pandemic. If I come up with a predictive algorithm to figure out whether you're infected, the performance of the algorithm will change if the virus is highly prevalent in your community or not so prevalent in your community. And so that's a parameter that is local. It's a biased. It's a bias of your local population that has to be reflected in the algorithm, and people might not do this at the outset. So, for example, it may be that if a clinic is using a retinal recognition program and everybody is African American, to get better performance, you may actually want to include that bias in that algorithm for that deployment, as opposed to one that's in a country which doesn't have any people of African extraction. And so I think it's even more entangled than Dr. Gassimi implied. I think that there's times where the change in healthcare, which is dynamic and heterogeneous across our country, has to be captured. And if we don't include these local differences and treat medicine as if it's a homogeneous entity across our country, then by being, in our view, debiased, we're actually not customizing to our patients, which is our first responsibility.
So let me say, there are so many definitions of bias, right? So there's like statistical bias in a model. There's personal bias or societal bias. The bias, I think that the term that I'm the term that I am loosely using right now is sort of structural inequity, right? Like unjust bias. And when you think about, or when I think about unjust bias, I think it's unjust bias if it perpetuates systemic structural injustice that's been visited upon a certain group of people for many reasons, right? And so if, for example, women's pain is ignored when they go to the doctor, and we make an algorithm that perpetuates that structural systemic injustice, that's a bias that's bad, and we don't want to do that. Models are really good at picking up patterns that are subtle, that maybe a human might not pick up. And so you want to make sure that while we're picking up these really localized hot pockets of COVID, we're not picking up that, but within this like hotbed of COVID, certain people are being treated differently, right? Maybe because, for example, the medical devices don't work as well for them. I wanted to say briefly though, because there's a bunch of clinicians on this call, and so I'm going to throw the ball back at you all. How do we address these inequities? I think that the question always for me is, well,
doctors are biased. Doctors kill people, right? Like, doctors don't treat all people equally because they're humans and humans are biased. And if I read another gender concordance survival study or race concordance survival study, I'm going to cry by myself in my room. How do we fix that, right? I think that it's really hard for me to think about a way of deploying algorithms in a equitable sort of just structure when it seems like there's no structure there to deploy it into because we don't audit doctors. Like, what receives these sort of principles that we're trying to build?
Whereas I agree now, doctors have all sorts of bias. In some ways, I'm very fearful about the bias that's going to exist in the sense that Dr. Gassimi did, in fact, define it, will exist in these algorithms, but not because they're a black box, even if they were a fully interrogatable box, because clinicians are busy and they'll just use it. We'll have this one standard and it will run roughshod over individual differences at different healthcare systems and individuals. And this is arguments I had all the way back in grad school, where you can have a grand utility machine informing decision making. And I don't think we've solved the strong AI problems, the common sense AI problems. And so by not recognizing essentially when you're out of frame, when the underlying assumptions are different because the population is different, because there's new medications, things have happened, there's data shift that's happened, whether over time or place. Things will go actually awry and populations will be discriminated against. And again, it happens every day today. So for example, the simplest test, just as Dr. Hightower said, a woman who takes a BRCA test for BRCA1, BRCA2, there's a probability of breast cancer given some variance. If you're Ashkenazi Jewish, that probability is quite different. And if someone does not include that in their calculation, if they do not discriminate based on the ethnicity of the patient being a Jewish woman, they are actually underserving in a very unfortunate way that patient. And I think that's going to be increasingly true as we can get more and more precise about our medicine. The other thing I want to say is that precisely because of the individualized nature of of practice in a poor neighborhood in Atlanta, Georgia, and an upscale neighborhood in the east side of Manhattan, the ability for doctors to innovate and develop their own AI algorithms is, in my mind, absolutely essential for both innovation and for justice to occur. And for that to happen, we're really going to have a different regime whereby, once again, as was the case 40 years ago, doctors who are quants, who are computationally sophisticated, can bring safely into play the algorithms that represent the best interests of their healthcare system and their patients.
So I think we're going to see a Cambrian explosion of FDA-approved AI solutions over the next few years. Are health systems equipped to evaluate all of these different solutions for adoption? And what kind of teams do we need to do that, to pull that off?
Maya, this sounds like a question for you.
Exactly. No kidding.
How are we going to do all this?
How we're going to do it in an equitable way so that we don't leave patient populations behind and perpetuate systemic bias, specifically those that perpetuate disadvantages on health resources and health outcomes. That's where we do need help. But like I said, we have some pretty good, robust systems for evaluating based on say, a rubric. And what we need is more robust process by which we can evaluate these algorithms But just because there is a more robust process in an academic medical center like the University of Utah with tight relationships with one of the most established, oldest BMI departments in the country, doesn't mean that every single decentralized hospital healthcare system is going to make decisions in that same way. So academic medical centers are equipped to make a more informed decision, perhaps. I mean, whereas a small community hospital, a small rural hospital, who is similarly in the marketplace, receiving the same attention from vendors and looking for quick solutions on how to improve the quick care that they provide, will not have the tool set unless there's some sort of external mechanism by which our community hospitals, our smaller hospitals, or those that aren't robust have a team, can assemble a team. A team takes resources, right? It takes
I have a question about how regulation might play a role in this, might be helpful. I don't know if it could be, but one of the things that I have been surprised that is absent from, for example, the Spirit AI or the Consort AI checklists are performance guarantees across different subgroups. It's like, it's a hot thing in AI right now. Why are they not looking at this? Or even in, I think the FDA has done a fantastic job in having this, medical algorithm sort of clearance and pre-clearance program, getting a lot of input from the community, talking about transparency. But even there, I'm not seeing we expect to see this kind of subgroup performance be at least equal, right? And I understand the point about claims. Oh, just really narrowly scope your claims. I'm worried that if we tell everyone, well, you can just narrowly scope your claims, we're going to end up with a lot of devices and algorithms and bells and whistles and treatments that only work on wealthy white people. Like
Well, guess what?
Yes.
Well, guess what? That's the world we live in.
That's what we live in now. I know.
Exactly.
And
our medications are currently either tested mostly on white people or increasingly on Eastern Asians, because it's those are the populations where the efficacy, there's no representation that these medications are equally efficacious in African Americans or Indians or
there are never any Western Asians. I'm telling you, I look for the line, like how many Western Asians were in the sample? 0. It's always 0 Western Asian women.
But my point is,
the Consort pre-AI version doesn't make any such guarantees for drug trials around ethnicity. So I'm just saying that you'd be leapfrogging the current state of inequity in trials.
I think that's the point, right? Everybody has gotten really up in arms about, well, AI could kill people and could be like killer, it could be racist, it could be sexist. And I look around, I'm like, but we're already killing people. We're already racist, we're already sexist. So maybe we can use the fact that this conversation is so dominant, like the machine learning community is hypersensitized to this issue. Like they took it on and said, wow, okay, this is not something that we want to be the hallmark, around the neck of the machine learning community. We don't want to be known as the people who kill people. And so really now, all of the conferences have tried to, you have to put in a broader impact statement to all of your technical papers at NeurIPS, the biggest machine learning conference that we have globally. We have whole separate conferences that have sprung up around fairness, accountability, and transparency in machine learning systems that are fundamentally socio-technical because they're interacting with society. So I feel like the community has sort of tried to rally and address this head on. Maybe we could use this to say, well,
you know what?
I think it's a great point, because you reminded me of something extremely important, which is the computer science community was approximately at least 20 years ahead of medicine in terms of open access publishing. And it took that community to then see the computational biology community, which then finally has almost succeeded in seeding the clinical research community, so that this open access preprint model, which used to be viewed as somehow anti-intellectual and anti-progress is now the norm. And so all I'm saying is that there is an interesting set of precedents where good societal behavior has actually been pioneered by the computational community.
But the computational community is still afraid of physicians, and that's why they focus on comparison to physicians rather than outcomes. I strongly disagree with you, Zach, that it should not be about outcomes. I mean, I don't want to pay either for myself or for as taxpayer for someone else for something that is expensive like Glamour AI, which doesn't improve outcome. Why do that? And so going back, I want to go back to what Marzia said, because we are literally going through this right now in Japan. So we have an AI that is FDA approved here. For, it was validated on African Americans and Hispanic Americans for different races, ethnicities, and ages. We went through all of that. We actually had to spend a lot of extra money to go into inner cities and do our trial sites there. And so now we have it for this essentially US population, and we can claim, and I think rightly so, that on 30 million people with diabetes, it's equally, it works on all of them, and it's equally safe for all groups. So we go to Japan, and it has not been evaluated on those, and now we're literally going through the motions of essentially adding to our trial a subgroup of Japanese to make sure that there is no Japanese race effect on sensitivity and specificity.
So Dr. Abramson, I'm going to counter disagree with you in the following sense, which is, I don't know, I think you must live in a much better world than the rest of us live. Because, for example, if I did an AI program that said, we are going to affect diet so that people have a lower glycemic index, so that we have less heart disease, it may be 10 to 20 years before we can actually show a statistical effect. If I'm going to wait for all these things to have an outcome, then forget it. Instead, we're going to have to do these process measures, which we know from multiple trials sometimes do not correspond at all to the outcomes. So actually, I challenge you, and on most outcomes that we care about, we will not have the outcome data, period.
So, I mean, in pharmacology or in drug trials, FDA solved this years ago with surrogate outcomes, which then lead to problems like we take cholesterol levels as a surrogate outcome for cardiovascular death. And it turns out, well, actually, it's a little bit more complicated than that. So absolutely, there's problems with any proxy and any surrogate outcome. But there are surrogate outcomes that are valid, including in breast cancer, in skin cancer, and others. Right.
I mean, you say computer scientists, we don't focus on outcomes because we're scared of doctors. No, we're scared of your data because it's so bad.
But that's why we use images, right? I mean, you look at mycin and short-lived, right? You use doctors typing. That was horrible. And now we have images that are totally objective. And so the
images
data
are not objective. Images
based on operator and where you take them, but way more objective than a doctor listening to a patient and typing in, right?
Yes, I agree that they are more objective than a doctor having to solicit the right information. But
I apologize for my enthusiasm. Sorry, you're right. But it's way better than it used to be in the 60s and even in the 80s.
I agree that things are getting better. And just to be clear, I'm a proponent of machine learning and AI being in medicine. I think it's a good thing. There's a reason I'm in this field. I just think that you have to be incredibly careful about all these things in ways that we haven't thought of being careful. And I think the problem with proxies is that we use these outcomes because they exist. We need something, we talk to our clinical collaborators and they say, use death. That's gold standard labeled, right? It doesn't matter that you can keep a rock alive in a modern ICU. We don't have anything else coded, right? Like we don't have other measures that they feel confident in.
Wait, there is sort of retrospective data where you have that problem. If you do prospectively, at least you know what outcome you're looking for and how to measure it, right?
But prospective evaluations of machine learning algorithms are not well taken in all medical settings, right? So the problem there is now you're dealing not only with how accurate is my model, did I make it, that's a whole machine learning side of it, the accuracy and the optimization. Then there's the middle space of, is it robust? Is it private? Is it fair? And then there's this whole other set of questions that honestly people like me often don't tackle. Like if I showed it with pink text, would the doctor ignore it more? If I showed it with a cute little robot saying, Dr. A, go to room B, would more people listen to it and actually perform the outcome that I'm suggesting?
even if it was incorrect. There's all of these human-computer interaction questions and decision theory questions that have nothing to do with the algorithm. They have everything to do with how we're showing the information, how the person who's receiving the information feels about it, whether they trust it, whether they don't. And I think that's been both under-characterized in an AI and health setting, but very well characterized in a robotic setting. There's a lot of really good work by Ayanna Howard at Georgia Tech demonstrating that people overtrust robotic systems in situations where either they believe the robot has access to information it doesn't, right? Like I don't have access to this information, I must trust the robot, or that the robot system is mitigating the risk somehow. But both of those are present in medical settings.
So that's a very good point, and I want to point out another area which I think both computational scientists and doctors thinking about AI are not sufficiently aware of a pretty deep divide. When you look at an image, for all the issues, and there's certainly biases, Dr. Gassimi, you're absolutely right, but it is a set of bits that have some autocorrelation properties, and you can say certain things about it. When you're looking at a clinical course, as we do in many applications of AI, and try to predict an outcome, what is in the prediction is the behavior of doctors. In other words, you're learning from the behavior of doctors. So in the image, there's no doctor there. There's a little bit of doctor when they decided to obtain that image. There's a little bit of the doctor there, but it's not the flagrant thing of in the healthcare system where most of the data items are doctors decide by doctor. So you're actually learning from the doctor. You're not learning from the biology. And I think we don't see enough the difference between those two, because I'm going to be much more confident about image-based metrics than I am about a time series EHR-based metrics, because I just know how much more there is variation in the slab of tissue that's obtained in the OR or the retinal image. But I assure you it's less than the practice of medicine in different cities, and the how current, aggressive, or venal different doctors are in different systems. And that's going to make our evaluation process for those algorithms that are very doctor in the loop dependent quite tricky to evaluate.
I believe that all of the data that we could touch in a medical setting is so driven by process and by clinical prerogative, like the clinician's prerogative, that there's not a lot we can do to pull ourselves out and actually study real biology. I don't think it's about studying biology anymore when we get to this kind of data.
I completely agree, but that's the problem, because many outcomes, for example, let me give you a wonderful example. I was taught when I was young that keeping your blood sugar low and having a low glycohemoglobin was what you wanted to do, and certainly true in pediatrics for diabetes, to avoid having retinal damage. But there's been a few trials with adults where getting it too low actually maybe doesn't have retinal damage, but it actually causes death from other things. In other words, the process measure, glycohemoglobin, was actually the wrong gold standard. Ultimately, it was, and the optimization point was actually different than what the doctor said. And those outcomes are very hard to take, and you can actually be misled by the process outcome. In this case for adults, minimizing glycohemoglobin was actually the wrong thing. And and the problem is medicine is a beautiful art, but it's barely a science. And as a result, many of our intuitions of what constitutes a solid correlate to outcomes again and again gets proven to us to be wrong.
One of the biggest problems is that if you build an AI and then test it in clinic, when you actually want to test it on a population out there, let's say in a primary care center, which is what our problem was, and you test it in clinic, in ophthalmology clinics, you get spectrum bias, because you will get more cases that were recognized by clinicians previously as having the disease. But what you don't have is those cases that those clinicians are less good at recognizing as having disease. So you lose all of that. That is part of what you said, which is, by the way, why I like autonomous AI so much, because autonomous AI, at least the decision is never overseen by a human, and you don't have this weird interaction like you have in many assistive AIs in radiology, where the doctor is variable and the AI is static, and you just don't know what the output actually means.
Machine learning systems are very fragile, right? And they're fragile in ways that you don't understand until you audit them. And I'm sure you've all seen the terrible video of, you know, if you inject the right adversarial pixel, just one pixel, right? Everybody's seen this, I hope, and is terrified of it, right? You flip one pixel, but it's the right one. And the decision goes from that's a toy turtle to that's a toy gun, or not even a toy gun, it's a real gun. It's the same image, right? But the machine learning system has weaknesses, numerical weaknesses, because it's just a bunch of multiplication. And so,
that's actually a very good point. These things don't think like we do. They certainly don't see like we do. But I think we need to start wrapping this up. And I would like to, I think the right person to wrap this up is actually Dr. Hightower, because Dr. Hightower started us in a really good place by telling us all the things that she has to do and I'm sure she's both underpaid and understaffed for all the things that she has to do in her institution to track this. But
how do you see this evolving? Are there conversations in your hospital about these evaluations? Do you think are you seeing increasing sophistication and thoughtfulness in this regard?
Yes, so absolutely. And again, definitely addressing the low-hanging fruit that are embedded within our clinical decision support and developing at least a 1.0 version of a rubric by which we can start assessing, undertaking a continuous improvement process so that over time, as we continue to learn and leverage the expertise within our community, are able to develop a greater robustness around our processes that we can say with surety perhaps creates that marketplace for consumer evaluation, head-to-head evaluation of AI solutions, or evolves into a system by which we can both evaluate our own internally developed AI solutions more robustly, as well as the ones that are commercially available. So in other words, let's just get started and bring us a good group of people to the table.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank Drs. Hightower, Abramoff, Gassimi, and Kohani for what has been a very stimulating discussion. I've certainly learned a lot, and it's clear we have a lot of work to do in the space of evaluating AI for clinical care. So thank you all. That wraps up the panel discussion. We will now move on to questions from the audience. Okay, our first question is from Sean. Sean asks, if bias is useful, as Dr. Abramoff implies, how do you create language to educate and make users aware of local differences that affect how data should be interpreted? Zach, could you answer that question?
So bias can be useful because bias tells us about local vagaries, local characteristics that might inform how we classify, how we predict. And I think there's two classes of users that we have to educate. One is patients. Patients need to be comfortable in letting us know what's peculiar, what's different about them, including, if necessary, race, ethnicity. And doctors also have to be aware of it. And ultimately, the programs that we train with data also have to be able to understand that kind of bias. But perhaps Marzia or Dr. Marzia or Michael can actually comment about that kind of bias versus perhaps other systematic biases from the algorithms or data.
Marzia, you want to go first?
Sure. I think really briefly, the issue is that often when you have bias, it's very hard to understand when it is useful and when it is not useful, right? So it could be that you're saying, well, there's this treatment and it works better for people like you, but maybe it doesn't work better for people like me. Maybe it's just that people like me have been historically mistreated. And so I think it's really hard to disentangle those two, contextualized on the kinds of data we have in clinical care and even in randomized controlled trials. Michael?
Yeah, and so, you make a great point. I worry about how do you prove safety for systems, and the more complex and the more combinatorial explosion you have, the harder they are to prove. And so I was thinking about an example where there's lead in the water, right, in the drinking water, and maybe your priors then shift for your validation of your AI. But I would rather see, you know, components of a diagnosis that being validated independently, and as someone integrating that. And absolutely, there's this holistic approach to the patient. But your measurements should be, and that's really what I see AI being most useful for. I see the measurements as being as generic or general as possible. So I agree with you, Marcia, that it's very tricky. And again, the more complex a system becomes, the harder it is to prove it's safe. And how do you do that?
Okay, thank you. Our second question is from Prashant, who asks, the training of clinicians is biased, so how do we even know that the current reference standards for diagnosis are even accurate? Michael, you want to take that one?
Yeah, and absolutely, I want Marcia and Maya and Jack to weigh in. But yeah, as you heard, I love this question. I think what patients care about and what payers should care about is what is the clinical outcome for the patient. Will they see better or not? Will they die or not? Will they have a handicap or not? And so it's about outcome that we should validate where possible, and there's a cost to that. And I think many patients don't care whether physicians or clinicians disagree or agree on their diagnosis. They just want to get better. And so you make a great point. We should use outcome where possible. And I know Marcia has very different thoughts about that. So Marcia, what do you think?
What I would say is it's great to have like outcomes in a holistic, healthcare setting where we have all of the payer provider data on every person, and we know exactly what their environmental, exposures are. That just doesn't exist. Even in single payer systems, we don't have that kind of data often. And so saying we really just have to wait for outcomes to happen, and that's how we're going to validate the model. I think it's a tricky thing to do. I think looking at this question, right, are the current reference standards for diagnosis even accurate? No, they're not. But I think nobody really believes that they are. And so pragmatically, we all use these proxies where sometimes it's a combination of a diagnosis you were given and a treatment that you received and a late-term outcome that might have occurred in some people where there's lots of missingness interspersed. I think if we say we have to just focus on outcome, then we can't really do anything, right? Because there's just going to be so much missingness existing in this data.
Yeah, but I do think that there is, I think that there is plenty of data to show that there are disparities, and then we could focus on healthcare inequities, disparities in the data that we have. And that can be a reference where if we're seeing a delta, trying to understand that delta and closing that gap between whether it's racial, ethnic, socioeconomic disparities in outcomes, and even proxy measures. So I think that there is, data out there that we can already use without having to go for the gold standard of outcomes.
But yeah, I agree. But Marcia, we need to start small and build out. And right now we have a validated system for diabetic retinopathy, right? So we had an outcome, a surrogate outcome. And so let's imagine we want to build something for breast cancer screening. And can we use the data that we have on outcome to validate the AI, or do we need to do additional trials? I think because it will motivate people to collect that type of data. If we say, well, it will never happen, then we will not be collecting these data. And then in my view, we can never, it's very hard to prove safety without that. Because again, clinicians disagreeing doesn't mean anything very much to me.
I think though, if you're going to, so I'm a huge fan of collecting all the data. I think it should all be collected. But I also think care is not practiced equitably right now, right? And so we don't want to just wait until we have that and say, and that's when we're going to have equitable systems that get deployed, right? It's pretty bad right now, as many lovely epidemiology papers have demonstrated. And so I think we should be getting all that data. I totally agree with you, Michael. But I think in the interim, we need to have some systems that are able to work with these gaps, right? And that are able to try and see whether, for example,
we can create systems that are less biased, that are more accurate, that work in sort of the intermediate phase. And then I think another thing that we don't really talk about as much on the machine learning side is, as we discussed, you really do need to evaluate whether these tools help at the task at hand, right? Like if you have some model that gives you some score and clinicians just don't like it, or they don't trust it, or it shows them the alert in a way that is annoying, they probably won't use it. And then you've completely wasted all this effort you put into creating a beautiful system.
Good point. And so one thing I've been saying is, autonomous AI at least should improve outcome, and you need to prove that before you prove, when you validate it. But yeah, I absolutely agree. I'm trying to go ahead.
I think there's a bootstrapping problem because on the one hand, we know there's bias in the system, and untoward bias system, destructive bias, and so I think where Michael is coming from is let's use outcome measures in order to correct for those. And I think it's great to start from there, especially with regard to safety. But I think, and that's a great way to start. But then as we go forward, I agree with what Marzia says and what Maya says. There's other sources of information and knowledge that we're going to have to use, because the hard outcomes will come eventually for some things. But yeah. But they won't for a lot of things.
Okay, our next question is from Peter. What is your opinion about using participatory design techniques to develop an AI healthcare service? This could include many stakeholders, and this could be an iterative process whereby the AI is also a stakeholder at the table. Maya, you want to take a crack at that one?
Sure, I think that's an excellent idea, and I've actually been thinking about how do we create an anti-bias task force and the type of people that should be at the table. Of course, the data scientists and the AI itself, but as well our community members, because what's important for our community may be different from what we perceive within the healthcare system as being important. And to Dr. Abramov's, to Michael's point about outcomes, the outcomes that we as clinicians may see as important may be different than what our communities see as important. So having that balanced perspective at the table, and then starting that iterative process of whether it's refining our AI to decrease the bias that's embedded within the AI because of the type of questions that our data scientists asks, by having that diverse group of people, I think will help to minimize that, even if our data scientists themselves aren't as diverse as our communities.
One of the clinicians who I respect most, every time I ask him, oh, what do you think we should do for a project here? He always tells me, don't ask me, ask the nurses. They do all the hard work. You should really be talking to them. So, but often I just want to say, within the machine learning community, when we do collaborations, we are overwhelmingly speaking to academic clinicians, right? And so I totally agree with you, Maya. Like, our focus is really myopic often, and it needs to be broadened.
And so I will second all of that, but a lot of the infrastructure already exists in the form of patient organizations who try to do exactly that already. We reached out very early to the American Diabetes Association as an example, who is, has done work on that for decades, including a lot of disparity work. And so we don't always need to build it from scratch. We can actually reach out to patient organizations because there's a lot of knowledge that is, somewhat unexplored, to be honest, for the machine learning community, I mean.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. The next one's from Mitchell. In my work, the availability of demographic data is either non-existent or questionable quality. How can we evaluate systemic bias in subgroups if the subgroups are hard to identify? I think this is a great question because, for example, race and ethnicity are not captured in the accurately in the electronic health record. Who wants to volunteer to take that one? Marzia, go ahead.
Omission of this kind of data is bias. I cannot understand why health systems at this point do not record things like gender or ethnicity. Even if you, I don't think you should sell that information to a company for a profit, but at a minimum, you should be able to run a one-line SQL query
and count the number of Black women who have died in childbirth in your hospital and compare that to the number of white women that have died in childbirth in your hospital. These feel like very basic facts.
Well, they're very basic. I totally agree. And that one of the, from an operations perspective, is making sure that we are capturing that data, that is as high of an expectation within our healthcare systems as capturing all other types of data that we do to tell the complete story of our patients. And so we really do focus on that process of collecting the data and making sure that it's accurate. But there's a lot of work left to be done, including validation against other data points. So we do gender pretty well, not as good with race. Definitely when it starts to, we talk about, language, preferred language, it starts to even deteriorate further. LGBTQ plus status, all of these these data points that are so important to the narrative that our data tells, is we just need to re-emphasize how important it is for our healthcare systems to be accountable to collect this data.
All right, Zach, let's let Zach have the last word, and we're out of time. Go ahead.
Oh, really?
So wow. So I would say that I completely agree with Marzia. What you don't measure, you can't affect, you can't manage, and so we do need to be able to get those information, those kind of information. And in fact, studies done out of Vanderbilt, for example, have shown that self-declared ethnicity and race actually correlate very well with identity from gene SNPs. Also, if you have address, there is a remarkable amount of socioeconomic status information that you can obtain probabilistically from someone's address, unfortunately. So I do think that we can and should use these. And by the way, this is not an international agreement, because I can tell you, European colleagues of mine find it distasteful and therefore do not put these into their EHRs. And so this is, I think, a very important question that was raised, and you heard our response. Thank you.
All right, I would like to thank all of the panelists for their time today, and also I'd like to thank the listeners that asked very insightful questions.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Jason and the panelists. That was an awesome and lively discussion. Really excited. Way to kick off the day. Stay tuned. We're going to take a 3-minute intermission, but no need to go anywhere. We're going to have lots of trivia questions posted on the screen for you to keep us all entertained. See you in a few. Hello, everybody. Welcome to SAIL panel number 2, New Frontiers in Healthcare AI. In this panel, we are going to be identifying big challenges that are facing AI right now in medicine. We're going to be imagining solutions to those challenges based on our real-world experiences and the experiences of the panel here. And we're going to hope to inspire you. I hope to inspire the next generation of scientists to really tackle these challenges. There's going to be lots of opportunities out there, and we hope that you take some of those on. So let's meet our panelists today. I'm going to ask them to quickly introduce themselves. Greg, would you like to start us off?
My name is Greg Hager. I'm professor of computer science at Johns Hopkins University, and I'm the founding director of the Malone Center for Engineering and Healthcare. My background has largely come from computer vision and robotics and their applications in the healthcare space. So a lot of my expertise really has to do with how do we observe people, how do we take data on processes within surgery, and how do we turn that into useful information to educate surgeons.
Excellent, thank you. Tiffany, would you like to introduce yourself next?
Sure. So my name is Tiffany Bright. I'm a biomedical informatician evaluation team lead. Imagine that on a business card for the Center for AI Research and Evaluation at IBM Watson Health. There I have a couple of different roles. First of all, I lead the qualitative team, and what we do is we evaluate the science of our AI tools. And so we work with our clients to assess how AI is working for them in the field. And that's really exciting to actually go out to work with our clients and to figure out how AI is really meeting clinicians. And not only clinicians, we work with our government clients as well. And so that's one aspect. And so thinking about usability, adoption, and impact. And so that's a lot, but my background is in clinical decision support, and I'll pause there. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you, Tiffany. All right, next, Anand, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, thank you. Anand Matabushi, I'm a professor of biomedical engineering at Case Western Reserve University. Also, I'm a research health scientist at the Lewis Stokes Cleveland Veterans Administration Medical Center. I direct the Center for Computational Imaging and Personalized Diagnostics at Case Western. My interest and background has been, I'm a biomedical engineer, but my interest has been in using computer vision, image processing, machine learning to interrogate medical imaging data, primarily CT scans, MRI scans, digital pathology, and biopsy images from not just a diagnostic perspective. So in other words, not just using these tools to identify the presence or absence of disease, which clearly is important to help in radiology and pathology, but also to ask the question about risk stratification of disease. Can we use these tools to identify patterns that might be embedded in the imaging data that could tell us much more about the outcome, about the prognosis of the disease? And ultimately, what I'm really interested in is trying to use these tools as what one would call companion diagnostic solutions. In other words, could we use these tools to aid clinicians in helping to manage treatment? Could we use these tools to identify who is going to respond, say, to chemotherapy or immunotherapy? So essentially, using these tools as a way of aiding in precision medicine is what I would describe what I do for a living.
Excellent, thanks, Anand. All right, Cynthia, the stage is yours.
All right, so I'm Cynthia Rudin, and I'm a professor of computer science, electrical and computer engineering, and statistical science at Duke University. And I work on interpretable machine learning, where our goal is to design machine learning models that are understandable by human experts. And some of our models are so interpretable that they can be used even in very high stakes decisions, like in intensive care units of hospitals. And so my goal is to try to, for any application where you think you might want to use a black box and it's a high stakes decision, we want to try to replace it with something that is interpretable with the same level of accuracy so that you don't sacrifice any accuracy and you gain interpretability.
Awesome. And by way of introduction, I will be your moderator today. I am Nicholas Tadnetti, Associate Professor of Biomedical Informatics at Columbia University, and I'm excited to participate and talk to the panelists. So to start us off, I'd like to discuss some practical applications so that we know kind of what's AI able to do right now, and so that way we know how to look forward. Greg, I know that you had a really cool story about how AI was being used to triage patients at Hopkins. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure, I can say a little bit about that. So this is a research study that we did, and I'm sure everybody's aware that with the growing availability of data, you can train machine learning algorithms to do many things. And it's very natural to kind of come at the problem from the point of view of saying, well, if I have images and I have a diagnosis, what I really want to do is to just replace the radiologist with a machine that can do diagnosis, detect fractures in images, for example. But in fact, what we looked at was the question of how can we build tools that improve the workflow and free radiologists from doing drudgery work that really is not necessary. And the idea was to look at the question of whether we could determine or find an AI algorithm that was able to detect normal images in mammography with very, very high reliability. In fact, more reliably than a radiologist would be able to detect that the image is normal, and that use that as a pre-filter on the images coming to radiologists. And what we found is that we could, in fact, remove on the order of 50% of the images in the data set, classify them as normal extremely reliably, leaving the radiologist to look at the images that were much more consequential. So the idea really is to use the machine to replace the drudge work, the over and over again work that's not really contributing value, and allow radiologists to focus more at the tip of the pyramid, the place where there's really high value in human input. And I think that really is an opportunity for AI in many directions. As we gather these data sets and we think about ways that we can use them, we shouldn't really be thinking about replacing people. We should be thinking about augmenting people. And the way to augment people is to allow them to focus on the place where people has the most value.
I just want to put out there that I 100% agree with what Greg said. I think that that's a great example where AI is not replacing the pathologist, not replacing the radiologist. It actually provides a way of providing, in fact, I think that even before we talk about triaging, even before we talk about eliminating the normal cases, the obviously normal cases, you actually have the opportunity here to risk or rank order the cases that the radiologist or pathologist sees, right? So as an example, in pathology, you take prostate cancer, coming back to prostate cancer, 90% of the biopsies that are done are completely benign. There's no cancer there, right? So if you had AI do nothing but just rank order the cases, you got 100 slides that the pathologist has to look at. Wouldn't it be great to just have an algorithm go in, identify the cases where there are suspicious findings, put them on top of the digital stack, and then all the other stuff comes below that, so that when the radiologist, when the pathologist goes in with their cup of coffee, she's looking at the cases, she finds all the stuff that's challenging. She looks at all of those, first thing in the morning, and then as the day progresses, you've got post-lunch coma kicks in. All you're doing is looking at all the other stuff where there's nothing really present, right? So just doing things like that, where in this case, you haven't even eliminated any of the cases, you just rank order them, could actually result in improving the diagnostic throughput and accuracy of the overall procedure.
I'll just add, we actually did look at that. So it's an interesting area. So we're able to rank order as well. But what's interesting about it is, from a machine learning point of view, it's actually a different loss function that you end up developing in order to create an algorithm that is ranking as opposed to classification. And so it's also an interesting example of how if you just kind of come to a problem and say, well, these AI tools on the shelf and I'm just going to apply them to my data, you'll get one answer. But as you get into the problem and as you understand how it fits into the workflow, it can actually shape how you think about the AI solution. I mean, I think the work that Cynthia is doing is very similar in that vein, right? What it means to be explainable has a lot to do with who you're trying to explain it to and what you're trying to explain. And so there's a broader theme here, which is AI is a tool, but there are a lot of tools you can apply in a lot of places. What you really want to do is to, I think, understand your problem space and be able to communicate that problem space back, and then understand what the right tools for that problem are and potentially customize them to the solution. So it's really not an A and B. It has to really be a holistic A plus B approach to apply AI in healthcare.
I also want to build on Greg's example, because I think radiology and particularly mammography is a really powerful. This is a place where AI could potentially revolutionize healthcare. And so we also have a project on radiology, but it's different than the one that Greg was talking about. So Greg is doing like lesion detection, or, trying to figure out whether there's anything in the image that somebody needs to look at. We're working on a different problem, which is, can you create a decision aid for the human decision maker to determine whether to give a biopsy? Right? This is a very difficult problem because it's very difficult to actually look at these images. I mean, I've had, radiologists in my office, and we're going through images, and I can't tell what the heck they're talking about. They can sort of see it, but I can't see it at all. And so, it can be useful to have an AI tool kind of telling you, well, I think, this part of the image looks like this part of this other image, and that's why I think that this is it. But we've had a lot of problems, to be honest. It's really hard because of things like confounding. Confounding is a real challenge in radiology in particular, because the algorithms pick up on things that you don't want them to. Like they pick up on just the density of the breast tissue, or they'll pick up on words that are in the image, or the type of equipment that the image was taken with. And so interpretability there is kind of really important, because if you don't understand the reasoning process of the neural network, then it's possible that it could be reasoning about things the wrong way. And the state that we're at right now is that we don't trust our models, but they're just as accurate as the black box models. They're interpretable, but they're saying we know that their reasoning process is wrong. And so we know that we can't trust them, and that's what we're working on right now.
The one thing that makes me think of is, one, it's inspiring how these algorithms can be used to help people do their jobs, help doctors do their jobs and practice medicine. But of course, they're only as good as the data sets they're trained on. And so it makes me wonder about, if there's biases in those data sets, or there's issues with those data sets. And I know we have a whole panel on this, and everyone should check that out. But I think it's important, so important, that we should bring this up too. I know, Tiffany, you've been thinking a lot about these issues around equality and around kind of having good data come in, making sure that there's fairness coming out. Can you talk to us a little bit about your thoughts around that and how important it is right now?
It's critical. That's one of the things that we're doubling down on, particularly around, I think that we have these buckets. And so we think about workforce diversity, we think about data, we think about analytics. And so all of that's critical to everything that's happening in social justice. And I feel like it's such a hip term right now. But it's, if you set that aside and we think about why is bias important? Well, and it hits all of those buckets. You're building these algorithms and you don't have representative workforce, then bias might not, stereotypes. Well, what's a stereotype? I might not even be thinking about that as I'm building these tools. And so that's one aspect. And then you get into data. We have to then also think about collecting diverse data sets. And different types also. So not just who we're collecting and, are we checking those boxes, right? But also the diversity of data sets. So it's not just, well, I talked to a patient, but it's patients, but it's also samples. It's you want that broader picture. And then diversity in analytics. And this is another area where my company is pressing in, because there's a place for being aware of disparities. And so you can't measure what you don't know about.
Yeah. Thank you. And it occurs to me that openness, or rather interpretability and explainability, might be a core component of that. How do you know if something is being fair if you can't interrogate it and understand what it's doing? So Cynthia, could you give some examples, first of all, kind of really what you mean by interpretable or explainable, maybe with some practical examples that you have, and then address this issue of fairness?
Yeah, sure. So let me first define a black box. So a black box is either a function that's too complicated for any human to understand, or it's a model that's proprietary, which means it's somebody's secret sauce and you don't get access to it. And there have been cases where, there was a paper recently where they discovered a problem in an insurance company's modeling system where the model was proprietary. And it was trying to predict who would need extra care, who would need extra care, and they were using cost as a proxy for care. So they were trying to predict who would be more high cost next year, and we'll give them extra care. The only problem is that the Black patients were receiving lower cost healthcare. they weren't less ill, they were just receiving lower cost healthcare. And so their scoring, their model ended up giving patients services who were, it was unfair. It was not giving Black patients as many services as white people, even though they were, just as needy of that service. And so that's a case where a proprietary model kind of led to unfairness, right? And if the model was transparent, somebody could have pointed out, like, oh, hey, maybe we shouldn't use that. We shouldn't use that cost as a function, as a proxy for health, the quality of your health.
Right.
But there are other cases where people are using kind of very complicated models in cases where you don't really need them. So for instance, there's certain types of data where neural networks are really, the best thing out there, right? Computer vision systems, so it's like vision, time series, and some natural language processing problems. But for tabular data, there really isn't a difference between machine learning algorithms. They're all kind of performing similarly. So lately, since we've been training students, particularly in like deep learning, and we sort of forgot to train them in everything else, it's kind of embarrassing. But in a lot of cases, you don't really need deep learning. You're not getting any benefit from it. And so my group has been working toward designing like point scoring systems, for instance, where you add up a bunch of, you get 3 points for this, 2 points for this, 5 points for this, 1 point for that. And they're integers so that you can really understand kind of how the variables work together jointly to form a final prediction. And surprisingly, these very simple scoring systems, which have been used in healthcare for however many years, but ours are based on obviously data and machine learning rather than sort of people just making them up. These models are just as accurate as any model you can construct.
And very similar to what doctors are used to seeing too, right?
It's exactly of the form that doctors are used to seeing, right? But to actually go through, to have the algorithm figure out which variables to include is combinatorially very difficult. And figuring out what point scores to assign, right? It has to be integers, small integers. That's also very computationally difficult. It's these are mixed integer nonlinear programs. They're NP hard. So it's actually very difficult computationally to solve these problems. But once you do solve it, you get a scoring system that can be used by physicians. They can explain the result to patients or to whoever needs to know.
So in this case, I mean, this is cool. So in this case, you're using the machine learning algorithm to build a simpler algorithm. Basically, you're saying we can use something kind of fancy, we can optimize over the space to pick the variables, but then we can turn that into a simple score based on those variables, which performs equally well as a machine learning model trained on those data.
Exactly. Yeah, we usually call the thing that comes out of the machine learning algorithm a model, but I know it gets called an algorithm also. But yeah, so we produce these very simple models, and those models can get used even in intensive care units of hospitals.
Very cool. It's a cool approach.
I'd like to just go back to something that Tiffany talked about, which really resonated, particularly social justice, which I think is something that obviously is extremely important right now. There's a lot of attention around social justice, and our group has been also looking at the role that AI can play in that space, at least to a certain extent. And this also goes back to something that Cynthia talked about with this model, this black box model, which found when we looked at cost alone, that it was identifying Black patients as not really being high risk, only because they were, it was the wrong factor that was being considered. We did a systematic study earlier in this year in the context of prostate cancer. And the particular question we wanted to ask was, when we looked at tissue images, pathology images of Black men with prostate cancer and white men with prostate cancer, were there any differences? What was interesting was that we were actually able to tease out differences in the appearance of prostate cancer on the pathology images of Black men with prostate cancer and white men with prostate cancer. But why is this relevant? Well, it's relevant because one of the big questions in prostate cancer is knowing how severe the disease is. 1 in 6 men in the US will get prostate cancer. 1 in 40 will die on account of it. But we know that Black men tend to have more severe disease, more severe prostate cancer, they tend to see higher incidence of prostate cancer. And yet a lot of the existing risk models that we currently have for prostate cancer have been built largely with a plurality of non-Black men represented in those data sets, represented in those learning sets, or training sets, or discovery sets. And what was really interesting about the work that we did was we found that there were actually differences in the area around the tumor between Black men and white men. And therefore, we developed population-specific models. In other words, we created a dedicated model that used the data, the images from Black men, and found that using that model then on Black men actually resulted in a much higher accuracy in predicting risk of recurrence. And when we looked at a non-population specific model or a population agnostic model, that model actually was not prognostic of recurrence in African American men. So I think I just want to make the point because it ties into, like I said, what Tiffany talked about, where we have almost a responsibility now to look to see how we can use AI in a way that really helps address the health needs of some of the underrepresented populations. And as we talk about health disparities, here is an opportunity where AI could help rectify some of those disparities and sort of provide more population-specific models to try to address some of these issues that have been overlooked thus far.
Yeah, absolutely. And such a potent example of how these biases can lay latent and unobserved. Like, you could easily imagine a bunch of medical students being trained to look at these images of prostate cancer. They just have a bunch of images of prostate cancer. It's not obvious that it's all from white men or non-blacks. They're just looking at images of prostate cancer. And so it becomes so difficult to identify these biases. So I think it's just a great potent example of how important it is to think critically at every single step.
There was a commentary in Nature maybe 2 weeks ago, and it was like, AI, you need to develop AI that's anti-racist. And I was all here for that. It's about being intentional. And so I don't think it's trendy. I don't think it's about a moment. I don't think it's about showing up and disappearing, but as a skill that is transforming medicine, somewhere in that training, you should be providing them with those critical thinking skills to say, well, if I'm using these tools and I'm making decisions based on these tools, to say, is it explainable? Is it accurate? That they're given the information to be making these judgment calls to assess, is it audible, that they have that knowledge, is it fair? I think that's reasonable to ask our developers and our designers of AI to give our clinicians. I think it falls on all of us.
So if I could just add to that, to what Tiffany just said, I think it's a two-way street. And one of the things that I try to emphasize to my students and my trainees is the importance of being multilingual and being the ability to have a conversation with clinicians, with physicians, and parlay in terms that they may understand as well. So I think just as we think of working with clinicians and them understanding or getting an appreciation for AI and how AI works and training sets and validation sets, I think it's also incumbent on the data scientist, the computational scientist, to also really understand the domain and understand it in a way that you can start, as you start to create your models, as you start to think about your models, you really begin to infuse it at the onset with domain knowledge, with domain information. Now, obviously, that's not trivial, but it can be done. As one example, one of the problems that we're working on in our group is looking at distinguishing lung nodules that might be cancerous from those that are benign. Right? So essentially, if you're, a lot of men and women get lung cancer screening CT exams. And one of the big challenges with lung chest CT scans is that very often a nodule will show up on a chest CT, and a radiologist is unable to tell whether that's cancerous or benign. Well, a lot of groups, I think Google put out a paper in Nature Medicine a couple of years ago, where they trained a neural network with a large set of CT scans, and showed that with a neural network, they could distinguish between benign nodules and malignant nodules. We thought about the problem and said, well, one of the things that you assume in these kind of approaches is that the network, that all the information that is useful to distinguish malignancy from a normal or benign nodule is within the nodule. So we said, well, we're going to challenge that assumption. So we work very closely with cardiothoracic radiologists, cardiothoracic surgeons, And we actually took a different tack. We said, well, we're going to look at the vasculature. Let's look at the vessels that feed the nodule. The breakthrough we made was that when we looked at benign nodules versus malignant nodules, the vasculature was quite different. In other words, the malignant nodules, the cancerous nodules, had a very twisted vasculature associated with them. The benign nodules actually tend to have a much smoother vasculature. And so what we found was that if using a very simple machine learning model in conjunction with features that relate to the complexity or the tortuosity or the fractal measurements of the vessels that feed the nodule, you could actually do a pretty good job distinguishing malignant from benign. You actually didn't need features within the nodule itself. We're actually doing all of this outside the nodule. So I think that sort of domain knowledge, where you're having the conversations with the clinicians, allow you to come up with features that are interpretable, that have a connection to the pathobiology of the disease. And one of the things, of course, here is that you've involved the clinicians in the process of the development of the tools. So you've got your adopters lined up already, right? Because they've been part of that process. So I just want to put that sort of other sort of thought out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's such a great example too. I often have students come to me, I'm sure you all do as well, who go to the literature and they see super high performances and it looks like every problem is solved and they get super dismayed at that. And I say, no, there's always another way to look at it. In fact, bringing some domain expertise is usually the easiest way to kind of take just a slightly different look, and you can totally open up a field for yourself. And you did that beautifully by just saying, no, everyone's focusing on the nodule. They're not thinking about the biology. That nodule needs to get nutrients somehow. Let's look at the vasculature. It's such a clever way to just change the scope of the problem and open up research avenues, which I think is something all students really need practice at, and they need to see that it's possible to do that. So medicine is really about human interactions. Caring for somebody and curing someone of a disease is an extremely human activity. And I think the humans should be centered in that process. And a lot of technology that's been introduced in healthcare has been rightly criticized for getting in the way of the patient-doctor relationship, that human connection. And I think there really is an opportunity for technology not to get in the way any longer, but start to disappear into the background and really put that interaction in the center. And I'd like to get your visions and your perspectives on how we make that happen. How do we bring healthcare back to being really about human connections and not about the technology standing in between?
Well, if you design the model so that a human can understand it, then the doctor and the human and the doctor and the patient and the machine learning model can all work together to solve a problem. I mean, designing decision aids rather than sort of decision makers.
Yeah.
I'll give you kind of my big picture perspective on this, which is I think one of the things that AI is going to enable is it's going to enable a much more holistic and longitudinal perspective on healthcare in the long term. So I think right now healthcare, when we think about healthcare, we think about acute problems, right? You go to the doctor because you are sick and you need a doctor to help you get better again. And what we really should be thinking about is how to keep people well, and what does it mean to have a longer term perspective or a longer time frame perspective on the trajectory of an individual and what's going to keep them well and what's going to support them in a very broad sense. So if you were a doctor and you came to a patient and you had access to this more holistic and longitudinal perspective, you can start to contextualize some of the things that you see in front of you. So instead of seeing a patient in front of you who basically you've diagnosed and say, okay, they have this disease, you can start to say, well, okay, I see they have this disease, but now if I understand the broader context of their life situation, their life trajectory, I can see that this disease really is a step along a path, and really what we should be doing is starting to think about how do we correct that path as opposed to how do we treat this one particular acute disease that happens to be coming at this point in time. So instead of thinking of just an episode, think of a series of episodes and now how they string together more into a story of health for that individual. And I really truly believe that's the way we need to start to think about healthcare. It's much more wellness preservation as opposed to healthcare itself. And I think AI could play a very positive role in that.
Yeah, I think Greg is spot on. I think that thinking about wellness is really going to be critical. And coupled with that is being able to monitor and capture information in a longitudinal way, communicating that information in a way that the patient is able to see more directly, as opposed to being just told, well, this is your prognosis, or this is the status of your disease, or this is your diagnosis. But in really engaging the patient in a more immersive way with their data might be also an opportunity for AI coupled with augmented reality and visualization to really drive that bond between the clinician and the patient. And also, I think, for the patient to take a deeper interest in their longer term prognosis, or like Greg said, their wellness, and continue to preserve their wellness.
Yeah, I think it's so powerful, the ways that we can imagine AI really facilitating the process. A patient is not just a patient on their own. There's a community of people who are supporting that patient as well. And figuring out how to really empower everybody can be a focal point of AI, and I think will be one of the great things that AI can do for medicine. We talked a lot about the challenges facing AI. I'd like to kind of imagine big picture. What if all of these constraints went away, or these biases were gone? What's the kind of blockbuster hit AI technology application that would really transform medicine? And Greg, I want you to chime in what you think, but I want you to start by inspiring us, because you've been doing some really amazing work by embedding AI technology with surgical practice, with remote access and remote surgeries. And I want you to just inspire us and tell us a little bit about that story, and then give us kind of where do you think you're going next with AI?
Thanks. So this is a project that we call the language of surgery. It was actually inspired originally by a conversation with one of my speech and language colleagues, where this was around when the Da Vinci robot was first starting to become more widely used. And we realized that that was a platform for recording surgery in a way that had never existed before. With a robot doing surgery, you can record the stereo video of the procedure, you can record all of the movements of the tools, you can record tool changes, energy applied. The entire surgery can be recorded. And so for the first time really in history, you could now create at scale, recordings of now literally millions of procedures per year, and you could start to use that as a source of data to gain value. Kind of put all this together and say, this is an enormous opportunity space. Any surgeon out there clearly would love to perform at the top of their field. They want to care for patients. They want to do the best job they can. AI is potentially a way that we can now bring these two things together. So in the language of surgery, what we do is we take these recordings of surgery, we break them down into the steps of the procedure. And what we've been able to show is that we can both structure that data into steps and also evaluate the quality of performance of those steps. So we can take data from an OR and we can tell you, for example, whether it's an attending or a trainee who's operating, just by the quality of performance in that data. And what we've also been able to show is we can now feed that back. So if once we know where you lie in the skill scale and we can understand where your potential deficits are, we can turn that into a training regime. So we can now say, look, here are the things that would be most useful for you to work on to improve your surgical technique. So our North Star is really, we want to take this data and we want to make it available to surgeons so that they can all become better surgeons, and as in the result of that, improve the entire patient care pathway in the surgeries that they're performing.
Cool. Cynthia, do you want to go next?
I think patient monitoring is, because as we were discussing earlier, like if you have sensors on patients and you want to, measure very subtle signals that will help you figure out whether there's something wrong with the patient before they get really, really sick and need to go to the doctor. Or in our case, so we're still working on these brain trauma patients, and these patients need to get medications. And these medications can have serious side effects, like the doctors are actually turning off the patient's brain so that they won't have a seizure. Yeah. So, the effects of these drugs are different for different patients. And so the question is, well, how do you sort of navigate what treatments to give the patients, and how can you adjust that over time automatically so that the patients are getting the best possible care?
Anant, would you like to go next?
Sure. In the context of cancer alone, lifetime likelihood that any adult in the United States will be diagnosed with some form of cancer in her or his lifetime is 40%. Right? So 2 in 5 men and women in the US will be diagnosed with some form of cancer in their lifetime. I think AI could play a huge role there from the clinician's perspective, post-diagnosis, in really helping to figure out the appropriate treatment strategy, the right management strategy for a patient, identifying in advance of treatment what their response might be. Are they going to benefit? Are they not going to benefit? Immunotherapy right now is the flavor du jour for therapeutics for cancer. Got the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 2018. And yet we know so little about immunotherapy. We know that currently, only 20-25% of the patients who get immunotherapy tend to respond to immunotherapy. And over and above that, there's a small subset of patients who get immunotherapy and then sort of get into this so-called death spiral. They're hyper-progressive. The immunotherapy will actually kill them. We have really no way of identifying right now, good ways of identifying who's going to respond, who's not going to respond. Mm-hmm. So I think that in a lot of these scenarios, AI could play a really, really critical, significant role.
Absolutely. Cool. Thank you, Anna. Tiffany?
So it's going to go back to what the first question that you sent my way. And I'd say that AI-driven applications of the future would be centered with racial equity. And part of the work that I'm doing affords me the privilege of sitting into some amazing talks. And so this idea of centering around racial equity is not it's not unique to myself. It's something I think we should be doing. And so it's the idea of saying, when we're thinking about the development of our AI tools, it starts with planning, and then it starts with data collection, thinking about those data sets and where are we going and all of that. And it's moving to data access. And we talked about, measurement and all of that, moving to then the development of our algorithms. Again, it's just, you don't just, I guess I'll back out and say, it's not, I don't see social justice as one point in time. And I think that when we are building our, developing our AI-driven algorithms, that social justice, again, isn't one point in time, but it's weaving it throughout the process. And so that's why it's this idea of planning, data collection, data access, development of the models, data analysis, and then reporting it out. And that's when you get to explainability, having that audit trail and so forth. So that's what I would say we should be thinking about for the future.
Yeah, I love that. It's not a challenge to overcome. It's a cultural change in the way the algorithms are being developed that is going to bring about real change. So as somebody who's leading in this area in social justice and AI and equitable AI, are you optimistic? Are we going to be able to do this?
I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic for several reasons. One, the voices are so loud. You look at what's happening in our society and we can't go back because people are aware, and so people are willing to change. And because people are willing to change and committed to change, I think we are going to do better going forward.
Thank you. I think we can end on a better note. Thank you to all of our panelists for being here today. I had a great time chatting. I hope everyone did too. And now we can open up to the audience for a Q&A. There's still plenty of time to get in your questions, so go ahead and submit them if you haven't yet. Let us know your name. Let us know where you're submitting your question from too. It's always nice to hear from around the world. We've got a real global audience today. Our first question comes from Wainwright. By using an algorithm to triage pathology slides that are most concerning, the pathologist runs the risk of paying less attention to those at lower risk of disease. How comfortable should we be with potentially ignoring those lower risk patients? Anand, do you want to jump in on this, and then we'll have some people respond?
Sure. Thanks, Nick, and thank you, Wainwright, for that question. So I'm not sure whether the first use case for AI for pathology slides is necessarily going to be on triaging the slides. Now, while I can't claim to know how the FDA and the regulatory approval is going to work for these triaging algorithms, I think the better use case might be in rank ordering the difficulty of these slides, so that when the pathologist comes in the morning, she or he is probably going to look at the most challenging slides up front, the slides that the AI has called out as having something suspicious, so that in the afternoon, when the post-lunch coma kicks in, the pathologist is now looking at those slides that the AI algorithm has identified as really not having anything. We know, for instance, in prostate cancer, that 90% of the pathology slides are completely benign. So a scenario where they're being used to rank order the suspiciousness of the slides might be a better use case than straight out triaging. But I think the question will be ultimately demonstrating the sensitivity, the specificity of a triaging tool if it's meant to be used in that way. I will also say that one of the clever uses for AI in pathology right now is by a company out of Israel that's looking at AI as a second read. So pathologists go about their business, read all the slides just the way they would. And the AI then looks at all those slides that the pathologist has identified as being benign. There is no evidence of disease. So essentially what the AI is doing, in a sense, is providing a check on potential false negative errors from the experts. So that's sort of another way in which you could use the AI, and there's no risk really there for any cancers being missed. On the other hand, there's an opportunity to identify cancers that might have been missed by the expert pathologists.
If I could just jump in on that, I just want to echo that, I think we're at the beginning of starting to design human and machine systems operating together. And we know that the right sort of combination of human intelligence and machine intelligence can produce a result that's better than both. And there are already many studies out there that show this. I think the idea of, for example, considering AI to be a second read, well, we know that from data in Europe that second reads always produce a better result than just doing a single read. So why not add a second read, essentially with no extra workload for the pathologists themselves, but improving the results. But I think the main point here, and I think I agree with you, Anand, there are many different models for this. And the question really is ultimately, what is the goal you're trying to achieve, and how do you get the best combination of human and machine intelligence to achieve that model? And these are just a couple of possibilities. I'm sure we'll see many more as this field evolves.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's been really cool to see all of you talk about how it really can complement, not replace. And if we're rational about how we implement it, we can address a lot of these problems. Cynthia, I'm going to ask you to address or answer this next question first, and then we can jump in. This is from Elham. How do you approach uncertainty in AI models, specifically when using algorithms that could be for very high stakes diagnoses? And I think you've been talking a lot about interpretability, a lot about, do we trust algorithms? And so I think this relates to the way that you've been approaching machine learning a lot.
Yeah, so there are statistical measures of uncertainty that are very well studied, but the problem arises when the uncertainty is beyond statistical. It's due to some bias in the data set or some confounding, or even the fact that the AI just hasn't seen a situation like this before. So what do you do? And the answer is, well, you need to go and talk to a human. So if you can build your AI systems that are very interpretable, right, very easy for a human to understand and react to, then the human can say, okay, yeah, this is, I agree with this. I'm going to give this person a biopsy, right? And humans tend to err on the side of making sure that the biopsies get given when there's potentially a chance that the person has cancer. So that I think being able to have the human in the loop actually helps you with the uncertainty that you can't quantify, the unknown unknowns, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. This next question comes from Josephine. It's for Tiffany. Josephine asks, she's probably inspired by the type of work that you do, asks that you get to see how all types of companies are integrating AI and informatics into their research and development. Are you able to tell us about a project that you find especially exciting where it's getting implemented?
Yeah, sure. I can think of two in particular. One was locally, it was working with some clients in California. And we were using a tool that sought to think about how do you provide better care to individuals experiencing homelessness. You think about that vulnerable population, and they were experiencing not only homelessness, but homelessness during a crisis and during the fires. And so working with caseworkers, working with members of the criminal justice system, and thinking about how do you deliver services in a coordinated way. And so we had a tool that really thought about that. How do you bring all of these individuals together to provide wraparound services? And it's really not that easy because it gets into some of the issues that we think about in AI, privacy and security. And so, we're not really using federated learning, but, it's all, like privacy is an issue. And so you've got data structure, you've got silos. And so how do you provide AI solutions that are protecting these citizens' data, but yet connecting the data so that you can say, well, John's over here and John's got a case. And if you could let the judge know that, well, John wasn't able to show up because he was in the hospital, or, he's unstable because he doesn't have housing. And so really working with, multiple caseworkers to kind of figure out the best way to provide that centralized care so that you could meet the services that were necessary. So that was really amazing, because at the end of the day, we're looking for solutions, and the technology is just one aspect. And I think sometimes we remember that, but it's as biomedical informaticians, we remember that, and you have to keep reminding others that is the tool is just the solution. Another project that I did earlier on was again looking at a tool, an AI-based tool, and we've talked a lot about it during our panel. Like, it's augmented intelligence, and it was, but it's like, how do you take this tool that's providing just augmented clinical decision support and evaluate it globally? And so it introduced a lot of different complexities because you had transcription, translation that was involved. And then when you think about AI, we don't really have, some colleagues wrote a paper about it recently, like, how do you evaluate AI-based interventions in the wild, right? And so there are, thinking about that and the usability of these AI-based systems. And so it's just interesting to do that work and to actually have to work with different IRBs. And so that was a really interesting project to walk away with, surveying these clinicians and now to be kind of working on writing that up to say, how is this tool meeting different clinicians' needs? So yeah, some interesting stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you for that. I see this question from Francisco, and it's really forward-looking, and so I want to bring it up. And I think I'm going to ask everybody to chime in on this one. Greg, I'm going to ask you to start, though. So Francisco asked, according to Amara's law, we tend to overestimate the impact of a new technology in the short run, but underestimate it in the long run. Could you identify or discuss some AI research areas or applications in medicine that are currently most underestimated or underappreciated that really deserve more attention?
Sure. Let me pick two areas to talk about. I think there are going to be many, but one we've already talked about, which is really working much more behind the scenes to improve workflows and to improve efficiency in healthcare. So the idea that we can optimize the sort of information that a clinician views, for example, so that they can most effectively come to a decision. So, for example, in the emergency room, I know some early work where there's using AI to automatically assess all the information about a patient to put a view in front of the physician that has all the relevant information. So, for example, somebody presents with a set of symptoms, there may be other comorbidities that you don't happen to know about, or they could be taking medications that are in the healthcare record, but you don't know about it. AI can pull all of that out and can synthesize a view of the patient and make it much easier for the physician to have the right information at the right time, render the correct decision quite quickly. Second area that I think is going to be quite interesting is going to be in the area of quality and safety. So for example, if you are, just a real simple example, washing hands. There have been a lot of studies about adherence to hand washing protocols and other sorts of infectious protocols. It's very easy to build systems that are able to monitor that and detect if there's a lack of adherence to the best procedures. In surgery, we're actually seeing some of the same sorts of things happen. So you're performing a surgery, you've missed the safety view in the surgery. You have something that can pop up and say, hey, we really should be capturing the safety view. So I think efficiency, I think safety, those are areas that you don't see a lot about right now, but I think ultimately they're going to have a huge impact in healthcare.
Yeah. Anand, would you also like to comment on that? What do you see?
Sure. I would go back to what I mentioned during the panel discussion and say that I think the opportunity for AI to make discoveries, to enhance what our understanding of medicine is. The example that I mentioned previously about using AI to learn fundamental differences in the appearance of disease between different populations, going back to some of the work that I mentioned on prostate cancer, finding differences between Black men with prostate cancer and white men with prostate cancer, and using that information to really create more specific risk models. Because if you think about the way we practice medicine today, we don't really have a deep understanding of the disease phenotype. We don't understand in which patients the disease is really going to work. Is it really going to have benefit? And I think that's an opportunity where AI could help glean additional features, additional attributes for specific populations who may or may not respond to particular therapies. And so I think there's a huge opportunity to take AI and really create these more population-specific models, but also really help address the issue of health disparities. I think it's something that there's a growing interest on, and I hope and wish that there's more research directed in this particular area going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the themes, Cynthia, you seem like you might want to say something.
Yeah, can I address that one?
Please.
I think the thing that's stopping a huge number of scientific research in healthcare and AI is lack of data. It's not an AI question, but if we could solve it, it would give a lot of AI answers. And it's so frustrating. You can't even reproduce a lot of the scientific papers from a few years ago. Sometimes you email the authors, like the lead author of the paper, and they say, well, I never actually had access to that data in the first place. That was done somewhere else by somebody else. And then you email that person and they don't have the data. It's impossible to get it. So how are you going to estimate the effect of drugs? How are you going to reproduce any scientific study and do a better job of it using machine learning if you don't have access to the data? Even monitoring, right? Even monitoring tasks, but there's always the trade-off with privacy to get the data. And if these, if we cannot figure out ways to make data available for scientists to use, then AI is just going to continue to not be used in hospitals. That's all I can say about that.
Yeah, I mean, are you seeing that cultural change is happening? I mean,
no.
I feel like we all kind of get out there and we put our stuff as much as we can. We put it up there publicly. We put the data sets as much as we can. We put our code on GitHub. But like, is the culture shifting? You don't really see it.
No, it's not. Even I thought when COVID hit that all of a sudden we would be getting emails from everywhere saying, hey, we got a bunch of data on COVID patients. Here you go. It's got a whole medical record for everybody with the COVID information and their survival and all this stuff. And no, I mean, there's a few databases that supposedly are available, but the truth is they're not. There's a lot of barriers even to get into those databases. So no.
Yeah, go ahead, Tiffany.
I think one area that I would like to see expanded is telemedicine. And I know that with COVID, Cynthia said, telemedicine, I think we're seeing it, but I don't think we're seeing it with AI the way that we should be seeing it. And so I think some startups are really doing some great work with remote monitoring and applying machine learning algorithms so that you can actually monitor asthma and, you know, cystic fibrosis by applying it to the data sets. But I don't think we're really seeing the explosion that we should be to actually see increased access through telemedicine the way that we want or need to.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, you know, the theme of today has been so much about there are huge issues. There are big problems facing medicine, and they're not informatics or data science or machine learning problems, but maybe the solution to those problems that have plagued medicine just for decades relies or lies within these algorithms that we've been talking about today. So with that, I want to thank you for a great discussion today and thank all of the audience members for submitting awesome questions. Sorry we couldn't get to them all. But stay tuned. We're going to take a 3-minute intermission now. You're going to get more trivia questions to keep you entertained. And then we're back with panel 3, the last panel for today. See you soon. Welcome back. Hope you enjoyed that trivia. We're on to our final panel of the day. We're here from moderator Charlotta Haug, international correspondent of the New England Journal of Medicine. Charlotta, take it away.
Hi, I'm Charlotta Haug. I'm the international correspondent of the New England Journal of Medicine. And I'm going to be moderating this panel where we're going to discuss how healthcare may be transformed by artificial intelligence, AI. Because the topic is large, we are primarily going to focus on transformations that really matter for patients' medical outcomes. There are two main ways that AI may transform healthcare as we know it today. The first is to use AI to imitate and improve what medical doctors and healthcare workers do today. The other is to use the power of AI to deliver solutions for patients that are completely different from what they are offered today. To address these two issues, we have 4 panelists with very diverse and impressive amount of experience and knowledge.
Hi, I'm Ken Ellert. I'm United Health Group's Chief Scientific Officer.
I'm Eric Rubin. I'm Editor-in-Chief of the New England Journal of Medicine.
Hi, I'm Peter Lee. I'm a Corporate Vice President for Research and Incubations at Microsoft.
Suchi Saria. I am the John C. Malone Associate Professor and Director of AI and Healthcare Lab at Hopkins, and I'm the founder of an innovative group building workflow-integrated clinical AI solutions called Bayesian Health.
So, Ken Ellert, I will start with you. I think many people think of United Health Group as an insurer, and you're a lot more than that. United Health is a diverse company with everything from care delivery to research initiatives to broad health services. Can you tell us about your work at United Health Group and give us your perspective on how AI may transform healthcare?
When I think about the areas where we can actually improve actual clinical care, clinical outcomes, there's 3, maybe 4 that actually come to mind. One, perhaps the most pedestrian, is just the helping in the navigation process itself. Healthcare is really complex when you have a problem, and figuring out where to get the best level of expertise possible in the system is critical. The second one is understanding, call them biological networks, getting down to how do the proteins, the metabolites, how does your genome interact with different things, which mechanisms are being fired by which therapies, so that we can think about customizing in a whole new way. We think about therapies today as maybe a drug, but maybe therapies are a little bit different than that, inclusive of multiple drugs. Lots and lots of people are on half a dozen different drugs. Together, that represents your therapy. How all those things work inside of you is pretty important. Another one would be is how we actually redefine what makes a reference for a person. Today, we might think, here's a reference value for a creatinine level. But that is actually just from a population as a whole. And, and we could think through that, but really what's important is you. So how we collect that data, how we model those things out is really important in that process. And then the last one is, an area around physicians. When I'm working with a patient, I need to have a concept that's almost like a patient's like mine, the one that's in front of me right now. If I go across millions and millions of patients, can I find the relevant set of patients that presented like this and actually get a therapy course, an intervention course that actually matches up with the best that's happening out there? So who are the relevant patients to actually look up against across the entire country or the whole world? Those are the areas I think that probably from our perspective would be the areas that probably would bring the most transformation to that clinical care process.
Thank you. That's great. Peter Lee, you have been working for over 30 years with different aspects of machine learning and artificial intelligence in academia, with government, and now for 10 years at Microsoft. Can you explain how AI may transform healthcare from your perspective, and how a company like Microsoft may contribute to this transformation?
Sure, thank you. And I think there's a lot to build on from Ken's comments. And really, I think the potential is just, I know it's trite to say it this way, but it's almost unimaginable. But when I think about how healthcare could be transformed by AI, maybe 4 things seem to me to be really imminent. One is, as Ken was referring, is really in the direction of augmenting what humans can do in absorbing and integrating knowledge for better decisions. So, for example, at Microsoft, working with our partners at OpenAI and others, we now have language models with hundreds of billions of parameters in their neural nets. And what that means is that we have emerging newfound abilities to read the thousands of medical research abstracts and papers that are posted every day and synthesize them into knowledge graphs that provide better decision support. Already, we're seeing that kind of technology deployed and in use at places like the Jackson Labs and other cancer centers to support decisions that tumor boards make. A second is providing intelligent assistance. Ken spoke to providing intelligent assistance to patients. Doctors need that too, to collaborate with care team members better and to enable them to focus on patients. And one of the things that I see emerging, not just from Microsoft, but from quite a few companies, we've been working with Nuance on this, is deploying a kind of ambient clinical intelligence that is able to listen to doctor-patient conversations and set up automatically clinical encounter note. And, in our early deployments, doctors who are using this, really, they're happier. They're able to focus on the patient more. They don't use their pajama time, to do their note-taking. A third area, I think, really has to do with AI enabling the merging of clinical practice with clinical research. I'm guessing the other panelists will have a lot to say about that. We talked a lot today about things like real-world evidence, but it's really taking the digitization of healthcare practice, medical research, and connected devices, getting it all in the cloud, and aggregating it together to kind of enable new sorts of analytics possibilities. And then finally, the last thing that's emerging is we're just seeing a lot more capability in actually bringing AI to bear on biology and on biological understanding. And, we've been involved with adaptive biotechnologies and other companies on really trying to map the T-cell receptor repertoire to specific antigens and then to disease states. And that's just one use case. There are just thousands that are being worked on today and are really starting to emerge into actual approved diagnostics and therapies.
Thank you. That's very exciting. Suchi, you're working on a wide range of projects, and but among them, you help build clinical AI tools for improving health outcomes for patients. And can you tell us a little bit more about that work and how you see that application of AI tools can be scaled up to transform healthcare today?
Absolutely. So I think before I go into specific examples, one thing I'd love to do is to kind of frame what's happening in healthcare today relative to other sectors. So in the last decade, we've basically spent a ton of our investments in healthcare and going from no data to data, going from no digital infrastructure to a digital infrastructure. And in other sectors, this kind of revolution happened in the 2000s. And once that happened, it was kind of amazing the number of ways in which business in these other sectors transformed. So for example, in banking, fraud detection, to be able to do fraud detection now, they can't imagine doing it without AI. And with AI, they've increased sensitivity dramatically, timeliness dramatically, and false alert rates of older systems compared to what AI can do is almost 5 times lower. And these other examples from other sectors are really important because in AI, in healthcare, when we think of AI, we think of it as like a thing that could be transformative, that has the potential, that is in the future. When I think in reality, today, now that the data exists, this is the use of AI in deriving value from the data that's being collected is the single biggest opportunity in healthcare. And in terms of concrete examples, building off of broad areas that Ken and Peter suggested, even if we just think of the simple thing of moving from the reactionary paradigm that we live in today to a more anticipatory paradigm, and this is true just all over the place in healthcare, it's going to make a big difference. Like in areas like sepsis, 10th leading cause of death, interventions exist. But the interventions are much, much more effective if you can apply them early. And the AI is pretty much the only way to identify conditions, syndromes like sepsis and patients at risk for sepsis early and precisely because of the heterogeneity of presentation across patients. We're seeing another example in stroke, the ability to use advanced AI techniques to analyze images and identify patients with large vessel occlusions means suddenly you can take this patient and refer them to a comprehensive stroke center, when previously you'd have a really complex workflow needing multiple consults, and it would take us upwards of an hour, and now you can do this in minutes. And these are, and let's move this forward to another example with where Ken started us with care navigation, readmissions. In readmissions, the ability to anticipate which patients are high risk and why, and tackling it proactively can dramatically alter the patient's journey. So I think this notion of like moving from reactive to more anticipatory is just sort of a thing that's present throughout healthcare that I'm hoping, that we can really do today.
Thanks, Suchi. Eric Rubin, you are editor-in-chief on what many would think about as a highly prestigious but also very traditional medical journal. What role do you see for general medical journals in this discussion, and how do you see AI transforming medical publishing and clinical care?
It's a very good question, Charlotta. I'm kind of the odd person out here because I have trouble setting up my own computer. But I do think that AI really can change what we do and change the practice of medicine. But how do we get there? What are the intermediate steps along the way? One of them, I think, is communicating the ideas that come from AI to the broader community, in particular medical practitioners and other medical researchers. And I know that AI has relied heavily on conferences as a way to disseminate information among researchers. That's great because it gives you the kind of feedback that you need from your peers and the ability to figure out how to do things differently. It's not such a good way of communicating with a broader audience, the people who are going to apply the ideas that people are coming up with in the field. And for that, the best way right now is the traditional journal system, publishing. And we have really the same sorts of goals that researchers in AI have. We decide on manuscripts, on what is going to be published on two grounds. Is it important and is it true? And each of those can be applied in different ways to AI. Now, as all of the previous speakers have suggested, measuring importance might be different for an AI sort of application than it is for a more traditional medical application. Particularly, the more transformative it gets, the less it fits into an easy box. And I think that's something that we as journals and that AI researchers have to come to grips with. How can we justify these differences from what we usually do? The second part, the rigor of with which things are done, has sort of very traditional metrics within medicine. And those metrics don't necessarily apply to a lot of AI, yet rigor is still important. And so I think that the field has to really consider what do they consider as rigorous, and how can we help evaluate that within the standards, presumably standards that are set up by the organization. So I think this is something very important. The reason I'm here is because I think that this is the part of the future of medicine and part of the future of healthcare more broadly, not just medicine. I'd love to see that AI not only helps physicians, but to some extent replaces the kinds of things that we need physicians for. So I'm looking forward to what we're going to learn from the field.
Thanks, everyone. You can see that there are very different perspectives here, but still we agree on the potential. The potential is huge. So let's start discussing some of the issues that stand in the way of really applying this broadly to healthcare. Many of you have sort of alluded to that there are some structural issues that is deterring the implementation of AI in healthcare. What are these structural issues, and how can we find solutions to scale this up?
Well, I'd like to address one of the structural issues, which really, I guess you could use the word data interoperability or the term data interoperability to characterize it. And we saw this really completely vividly during the crisis response in the kind of the early ramp up of infections in the US for COVID-19, where it became critically important within a hospital system, and of course across the nation, to start to understand what patients are being seen, or what COVID-19 encounters are taking place, what capacity do we have to treat those patients properly, and that capacity is hospital beds, ICUs, PPE, testing, and so on. And then how is that capacity being utilized? And despite the incredible digitization over the past decade and 15 years in all manner of healthcare operations, what we found was we still had frustrating inability to sort of connect the digital dots here. We had things like PPE tracked in digital ERP systems. We had encounters uncoded, but in free-form text in EHR systems. And we had a very little understanding of utilization. And most fundamentally, in terms of fundamental data interoperability standards, we couldn't quite connect rapidly the identities of people across these various digital silos. I am optimistic about the future because the world, and particularly the US, is moving rapidly to address these interoperability issues. But we really confronted firsthand during this crisis some of the work that we still have to do.
So you think it's mainly a interoperability question, or is it also, business cases that you have silos of data in different places?
Well, I think Ken is probably the most qualified to talk on that particular point, but I will say it does seem to be a combination of standards, technology, business priorities, and the regulatory environment that all conspire together to make this more complicated.
Okay, if I jump in, Peter, actually, I'd be interested just in your thinking around, on interoperability. We often think about it from the time that the data is in a computer system somewhere and it moves. But there's another layer to that, which is, not to be too philosophical, but what is data? And you think about how much of what goes into a medical record is determined by its words, its interpretation of what's actually happening. So there's the interoperability piece, and connected to it is this piece of how do we actually think and define, because the world's not a set of drop-down boxes that have, well, even that would be the same problem, but the world's not super defined in a way that allows us to break these problems down into an absolutely standard method.
If I may add to that, there's also the business case issue that Peter cited. What do you use an electronic health record for? As someone who contributes to the to EHRs all the time, I'd say that a lot of them are driven by insurance claims rather than caring for the patient or getting the most complete collection of information on that patient. And it's very common, as anyone who's looked at them knows, that notes about patient, the subjective part of notes and assessments, are copied and pasted over and over and over again. So over days or weeks for a hospitalized patient, it may look like nothing happened, when in fact there is a lot else going on. So I think we also need to not only think about standards and interoperability, but also what's the purpose of the data that we're going to collect? Because if we can anticipate that purpose, we can do a better job of collecting data that fulfills that purpose.
Ultimately, what we are, I think, all jointly striving for in healthcare, and I think the big opportunity business-wise in healthcare is that we all recognize that there's risk and loss at every point in the kind of healthcare journey that people go through. And I think fundamentally, we are all seeing the possibility that we can construct profitable businesses by eliminating that loss and deliver value that way. And so this is one of the unique places where there's a possibility that our mandate to make a profit and deliver value to our shareholders aligns with the societal need to have more efficient and lower cost and more accessible healthcare for all people. That's the dream that we're trying to get aligned. And I think, Ken, you're really in the thick of that. We're just trying to provide the compute cycles to empower what you do.
It's a great point, Peter. It's, the interesting thing about shareholders and for-profit and things like that is, I'd actually say is the term for-profit or not-for-profit actually is probably not what we ought to be thinking about in healthcare, because the reality is everybody has a stakeholder. A hospital does well when there's more admissions. A physician does well when they treat more patients. A pharmaceutical does well when they sell more pills. An insurance company does well when they manage the risk better. There's a number of different ways and different business models that people have. One of the biggest issues I think that we all struggle with is how do we get alignment across those things? So if we say, when we look at our fellow humans, that our real goal is that people have a better health outcome. They have the highest quality of life for the maximum number of years possible. I don't know if that's everybody's goal, but if that's really where the goal is, how do we actually align people across that so that then data is collected the way that it needs to be collected to actually make that happen? Instead of, Eric brings up a good point. A lot of EMRs, EHRs, they're used actually to prepare to submit a claim for reimbursement. Not because they're technically a for-profit company or a not-for-profit, but rather because there's a set of services and they do have a business model that they need to get reimbursed for in order to stay in the business of providing those services. So I think those business models and how they change, they actually determine how people pile up the data and then how that data gets transmitted, how it's used. What does better health mean? Better quality? Is it 2 extra weeks at the end of life? Or is it a better 20 years in the years leading up to it? I think those are some of the issues that really need to be solved for if we're going to solve some of the, actually it'll help solve the interoperability issues too. Yeah. If Eric and I are working towards the exact same goal, it's in my best interest to make sure that Eric has the right information to do things. And it's his to make sure that I actually can take that and compare it across millions of patients.
Now we are getting into subjects that are really important, but still it's not only AI, and it's more about sort of improving what we already have or doing it. So let's try to talk about how AI could really completely change the way we are delivering care or helping patients. I'll ask you to explain, Ken, first, your robot first idea.
Sure. Well, I'll see if I can say something controversial enough to get everybody else to pile in. So, one of the ways that actually we can think about how to leverage AI, data, systems, those types of things to improve outcomes would be actually just to look for things that are not being done that well today, or would be next to impossible for a human physician to do. And those areas are going to be areas where the data set becomes so massive that a human couldn't actually go through all of those areas. So if I said, I would like to get really good at taking care of a diabetic patient, if what I'm working with is that patient went into the doctor once this year, had a lab test done, we know what their A1C is, we know what their fasting blood glucose was that morning of that particular test, and now I'm supposed to help them do better. Probably not going to do very well, and I'm going to focus in on trying to replace a physician's ability to diagnose somebody now with diabetes with complications. But if I change this a little bit and think a little bit more like we all think about when we drive in the car now, I guess we don't think anymore. You have data that's getting generated the entire trip. It's getting generated about traffic. It's getting generated about, did you turn on the wrong street and do I need to reroute? I could do that in taking care of that diabetic as well, in the context of all the other things that are happening around it. I do want to know which medications you're taking, and I also want to know what happened the last time you were in a visit, but I also need to get something that's a little bit more streaming real-time data. One of the things that makes a continuous glucose monitor such a transformative technology is now it's 288 times a day that there's a data point coming off of you on how your body is metabolically processing. That, over the course of a year, that creates enormous amounts of information coming in, and I can combine that with other things. Try giving that all to a physician and saying, okay, what should this patient do next? So those types of patients need something that says, I need the bot, I need the AI to step in first and recognize what's going on. I might be able to say, hey, Peter, just don't have like a cup of coffee with 18 teaspoons of sugar in the morning. It doesn't work well for you. In that one-time visit to the doctor, nobody would ever know what that is. If the doctor didn't know, hey, on November 22nd, did you happen to have a lot of sugar that day? I don't know. In doing that bot-first type care, that doesn't mean eliminate the doctor. It actually means deliver the things to the patient that they need right now so that the doctor, the physician, can do a better job taking care of that patient.
Suchi, would you like to comment on this?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think just this notion of, we spoke about sepsis, stroke as examples of moving from, reactionary to anticipatory care. And that's just true across the board. Even something as simple as, right now, the fundamental patient-provider interaction, the way we think about it is because providers are too scared to miss anything, it's scheduled as 15-minute blocks. And everybody gets 15-minute blocks. Even that alone is completely crazy. I think once we move to a world where there's all this information that could allow us to prioritize which patients need 60 minutes of my time versus which patients don't need anything at all. Which patients I could just reach them at home in that moment when they're I'm seeing the sugar spiking or changing in a way that they could benefit from advice in some way, whether it's a person doing it or whether it's, a nudge on their phone. That notion of a shift to anticipatory care is going to be huge. And medical errors, like the fact that some say it's the third leading cause of death. Why do we have these? It's possible to prevent a lot of it from using AI and data, and as data is exploding, better use of it in order to be able to reduce and prevent these altogether. I think these are some really interesting examples where it's possible today.
Eric, I would like to ask you, so these are all really interesting examples, but how would you feel confident that they actually work?
First, I have to say in response to Suchi, I know I'm representing the reactionary part of the conversation, although I think that we are also very interested in the anticipatory side and health prevention and such in many of the ways that you and Ken discussed. I'd love to have the refrigerator counting calories and for everyone, and then having a bot figure out what it meant rather than having a long list as some patients come in with pages and pages of symptom scores, for example, which aren't particularly useful. But I think you ask a very good question, Charlotta. How do we tell whether or not this is right? And ultimately, no matter what we're working on, I think that we are interested in the impact on the patient ultimately, or on the individual if they're not a patient, on the individual ultimately. And that means rather than measuring some outcome like you ate fewer calories, that your diabetes actually improved, or that you didn't get a heart attack because your diabetes actually improved. And so the closer we can get to something that we care about, the better off we are. That's true in all of medicine, and I think it's also a standard that we should try to apply to AI. Now, obviously, that can be quite difficult. One of the big advantages of big data, though, are that we have a lot more things to look at, and we may have the capacity to look at the kind of clinical outcomes that we really care about more easily than we do within the standard randomized controlled trial. But I think if that would be my gold standard for what I'd like to see.
I actually think, Eric, our reliance on an RCT alone for evidence generation is dramatically slowing down the rate at which we can learn from our data. And that's so fundamental, even something like today in COVID, the fact that we didn't have answers to questions like, is proning effective or not? Should we try to do invasive mechanical ventilation early, or should we try to do alternative therapies? And these questions are very possible to answer in a pretty granular way using the kind of data that's collected today. And there are hospital systems with electronic databases, you know, where it's possible to interact with this kind of data in real time. But to me, I feel, you know, systems don't think of that as their go-to, as a way of pulling data, you know, evidence reasoning out. And that's so crucial for us to be able to, you know, be putting insights back into practice faster.
You know, in a way, I see both sides of this. My heart is with Suchi because the possibilities, I think, are just so present there. And we even saw that in the kind of analysis of the patients who were transfused over the past 6 months with COVID-19 convalescent plasma, over 71,000 of those. And we had fairly complete clinical histories for almost all of them. And at the same time, I understand Eric's point of view here, because there has been at times an irrational exuberance where me as a computer scientist and a techie looks at problems and sees them as tractable data analysis and machine learning problems. And then sometimes the medical community is overly dazzled by the emerging power of AI. And that does sometimes lead to an over-optimism coming from both directions that needs to be checked carefully. And while not giving up on the actual true possibilities in all of this.
I think which leads to this question that around how do we create standards? How do we create education in a way so that people aren't getting too excited about things that aren't real at all? I mean, you've heard examples, you know, there was, I think, a company that tried to say you could use an image and predict what this person's profession is going to be or what their IQ is. It's complete nonsense. But, you know, people get excited about things like that. So there's a lot of make-believe stuff. But and I think this is where, you know, journals have a huge role to play in terms of educating our readers in terms of, you know, there are ways in which we can build trustworthy, unbiased results now using the kinds of messy data that exists in electronic health record. And this has been one of the most active areas of research in machine learning in terms of how to build reliable and robust learning techniques. And so the question is, if we bring those kinds of technologies, it's still the case that people on the other end have to know how to assess it, how to know it is going to work, how to know that the results are reliable. So Eric, I think if you have any thoughts on that, that would be really interesting to hear.
So Suchi, I agree. Randomized clinical trials, RCTs, are the gold standard right now. And that has evolved over the last few decades. But we're not done. RCTs have tremendous limitations that you referred to. Right now, you can really only ask one question, and it can take 10 years and $100 million to get the answer to that question. And maybe you get some clues about some other questions from that, but you can only rigorously answer essentially one thing. And that has been evolving, and there are all kinds of creative solutions to try to bring more information out. But I think real world evidence is different. It's fundamentally different, and it's a work in progress to figure out how to make that rigorous. There is a marriage of the two. I think that there is the opportunity to use the electronic health record together with recruiting criteria to figure out what happened without going through the sort of traditional clinical trial track, which is really onerous, honestly. And I think we've seen some examples of that during the COVID outbreak. But that's not the final answer. Not a hybrid model either. I think the final answer is we have to figure out how to bring rigor and how to understand the rigor within trials that are not traditionally designed.
But that's the cool part, Peter. We can get to that endpoint today. I think even in the context of COVID, in several other clinical areas, we're seeing the ability to use data collected to date to understand for this patient, based on similar patients, what is likely to be effective. And then using the electronic health record infrastructure to surface that information to people who are your endpoints, right? Like, for example, your frontline staff, and they can take that information, they appreciate in our own work what we found. So for example, we're working in several clinical areas, but let me give you the example of sepsis that I touched on. When we're bringing information from this encounter and past encounters to compute and create a patient-specific baseline of what this person's likely creatinine is, or what this person's normal for blood pressure is, what this person's normal for WBC is, and then relative to that, we're seeing a deviation. And when we're bringing that information to the provider to flag a patient for risk, the provider is happier because suddenly they didn't have to click, rummage through the electronic health record, go to a past encounter, which they wouldn't have done anyway. And suddenly that information, when it's becoming available, they can, they can do something. So I think, to me, that trick of learning from data, that's possible today. I think one of the big structural barriers, besides interop, besides financial in some cases, is trust. We've got to figure out how to build trust. We've got to figure out how to move away from hoaxy-pokesy stories to understanding what's working, where it's working, how to communicate what's working.
Suji, I find your, how could I put it, a visionary optimism, both inspiring and infectious. And I think what you're saying is just incredibly important. Oftentimes in these situations, we are actually in a data poor situation, not in a data rich situation. The actual number of people who become ill and need treatment, for example, is small relative to the size of the population. And even the entire human population in computer science, deep learning terms is relatively small, only 7.5 billion. And in computing terms, that's not such a big number. And so we need to be parsimonious with the use of that data, that precious data, those precious encounters, to maximize the learnings.
At the end of the day, healthcare is every day, all day, right? It's not just in that doctor's office. And this notion of how do you integrate machines with humans, or like human machine teams, that's sort of in research how I think about it, to basically make the whole care process simpler, more easy to understand, and more proactive. So you're managing the whole patient, I think is very important. So like, it's really more like right now is just the doctor or nothing. But I think what we need is more integration, and integration throughout the spectrum, in care navigation, in understanding behavior change, in understanding early diagnosis, in understanding targeting of therapies, and so on.
Okay, thank you, everyone. This has been a fascinating discussion. We now want to open up for questions and comments from the audience. Thank you.
Okay, the first question goes to Eric and Ken. And Ken, you can answer first. Both the New England Journal of Medicine and United Health Group are looking for practice-changing AI. How do you evaluate whether something meets this standard?
I think at the simplest levels, are we getting a better outcome? And, the piece I would add to it to keep this really straightforward is a better outcome, and is it explainable? If it's not explainable, it's really hard to repeat that and move it into different areas. But I'll stop right there. Eric?
Well, I think I'm going to echo what you said, Ken. Our concern is, does this make a difference in that, will it change what happens to a patient, basically? And in order to figure that out, it would be great to have it tested that way, not simply the sterile test of how does this compare with some other standard, but do patients have a better outcome? Can we do a clinical trial where we see improvement?
Yes, and those are really difficult questions to answer in practice, aren't they? But Suchi, I want to move to you. You are straddling between academia and industry with a startup. How are you deciding which technologies are ready to make a leap from academia to be applied in your startup?
Sure, absolutely. So one thing that's very important when you're trying to make practical impact, it's what Ken and Eric said, you really want to think about the outcome you're trying to impact. Beyond that, you're thinking about who are the users, how are they going to use it, what are the consequences, including all these side effects. So it's not just at the moment in academia, we think a lot about publishing papers that show new models and evaluating performance of models. But when you start turning it into practice, you want to think about the use case and the use. And then based on the use case, you can think about unintended harms and risks. And if the risks are high, then you want to think incredibly hard about quality, performance. Is it, if there are unintended consequences, have you thought about every way to mitigate it? And then finally, if there's burden of adoption, for instance, if you have providers who are using it, metrics like positive predictive value, precision, sensitivity really matter because they also have, if the false alerting rate is very high, then you're imposing a lot of extra work on your users, or in this case, providers. And so just really thinking through all of the use cases and thinking about harms versus benefit analysis.
Thanks. So Peter, you are responsible for similar decisions, sometimes at a very large scale. How do your views differ from hers?
Yeah, and I think, of course, there's more common alignment with Suchi. In fact, I'm still an academic at heart, I feel, even though I've been at Microsoft for some time. But maybe if I were to add just one additional element to what Suchi said, that is related to scale, is to look at the long term. So if I look ahead, say 10 years or 15 years, and try to understand what do I think will be inevitably true about the world. Let's say if we look ahead 10 years, what's going to be inevitably true about the world in the year 2030? And then, through some combination of social, economic, technological forces, then try to work back from there to understand if some proposal or some idea, some technology is going to be important in that inevitable future, then that is sort of very motivating to make a decision to kind of bet bigger on this. So to make that more concrete, if we look, for example, at, say, aging demographics in North America, Europe, and Asia over the next decade, you can make some predictions about, say, the rise of age-related neurological disease that will be inevitably true in the year 2030. And based on that sort of view of that world, then you can assess whether technologies today that might be relevant, say, to the foundations of neurological disease diagnosis and therapeutics are worth a kind of upfront investment today. So I think overall, there's not much difference between the way I at Microsoft would think and the way Suchi in the startup situation would think. It's just that because we're always having to bet only on things that have a chance for really monumental scale, we have to kind of look ahead over the 1 to 2 decade time frame to understand where that scale might be living.
Thanks. Yeah, Ken.
Just to jump in on that, one of the things that we see that happens a lot from an academic perspective is just because a problem is solvable doesn't mean it's actually interesting to be solved in regular practice and regular life. And being able to actually focus in on what job is actually being done. Am I actually satisfying something that can take whatever technology I'm working on and pull it forward is pretty critical. And I see a lot of folks who are coming out of from an academic perspective and then moving into an entrepreneurial type role, and they're usually missing that part of it. And then there's a lot of questions about why does this not get implemented faster? And it's not the most important problem for us to work on. As an easy one, from a domain expertise perspective, I went to an organization, it's a startup, and one of the things that they were especially proud of is that when I walked in the front door, they could tell me what my height was by using some cameras. And our immediate response was, I didn't realize we had a height problem in healthcare. That's not the biggest problem that we have in a clinic right now. And they had put enormous amounts of energy into it. And it was actually really kind of cool how they did it. But those types of things I think are really important to actually work into that transition from what's interesting to write a paper about, what's interesting to actually put into practice.
If I can jump in, actually, I'd love to ask Ken to comment a little bit on how peers are, if peers are, how you're already using AI, at United. I think that would be really interesting for the audience to hear a little bit from a peer's perspective of where you see the opportunities.
Sure. There's an easy one that I think people would expect, which is I think most of the larger payers are using AI on a number of administrative type processes. Forms come in, data comes in. How do they process that, get it ready for what comes next? There are more interesting areas that we look at it from a perspective of, are there things that we can have a machine do that would be really hard for a human to do the job? Though there are a lot of areas there from a payer perspective that are particularly interesting. So if you're a payer and it's done right, intercepting somebody's disease earlier in the process, getting an appropriate test and appropriate screening actually is better for the patient, and it is better financially as well. That is really hard to do, though, when you're looking across millions of people and trying to find the person that you need to go and intercept with. And so in that case there, looking at lots of data on millions of people for a very particular set of facts around it that would cause me to say, wow, that is a patient, I need to order a test on that person right now before this gets more severe. An easy way to think about it would be like in cancer, for example. Most cancers that we think about on a regular basis, maybe not some of the really extreme rare ones, are things where if you could just intercept and find it a little bit earlier in the process, there are things that can be done to keep the person and move them into remission or to find something that's curative. But when it gets later, that doesn't work. That's a job that would be really hard for a set of humans to actually take on.
Really nice.
Yeah,
Eric?
Could I add one thing to that? Because it's a really interesting point. First off, I'm glad that it's a virtual panel so that the height issue didn't really come up for me with your gadget, Ken. I guess I divide things into two categories. The kinds of things that people can implement in AI. There are the let's do the same thing we're doing right now better. And then there's let's do something that we could never do before. And I think we're hearing examples of both of those. The height measuring machine is awesome if that were an important problem. Unfortunately, it's not. But the cancer detection earlier than any other modality can do it, that's a more revolutionary question. I think there's room for both of those, but I think you can think about opportunities where there is no paradigm, you're breaking the paradigm, versus those where you're doing a better job of what people are already doing before.
Hey, if I could chime in just to stay on this topic, and just for the record, I'm 6 feet 2 inches tall. I think that these ideas that are fundamentally AI powered in really analyzing population scale data and also related ideas, for example, in real world evidence, I think are really coming to the fore. But at the same time, I think the computing technology community is starting to learn really for the first time just how challenging they are. From the outside, they appear to be completely tractable and relatively straightforward problems. But when you really start to dig into specific use cases, there's still a long ways to go. And roughly speaking, the ends, the total amount of, let's say, individuals that are being studied in any population study, in computer science terms, with our current computing technologies, such as deep learning, are still relatively small. And so I think that we will be looking for a while at new paradigms in machine learning, alternative paradigms in machine learning, to really make these things effective.
Yeah, very nice. One question to you, Peter, that a follow-up to something you said earlier about the possibilities for AI to merge clinical practice with clinical research and to use that. Could you elaborate a little bit on that? Because that's a very interesting concept.
Yeah, and I think, in fact, we encountered a lot of this during this COVID crisis response. One of the things, for example, that I had quite a bit of contact with, and still do today, was in the Mayo Clinic-led effort on the compassionate application of transfusion of COVID-19 convalescent plasma. And it was a tremendously large early access protocol, enrolling over 100,000 patients, with over 71,000 patients actually successfully transfused. And for the vast majority of those 71,000 patients, there were tremendous access to clinical histories in electronic form. And so it was almost a perfect situation in modern era where we ought to be able to take all of that clinical experience in a compressed time frame and extract information about safety and efficacy of that experimental therapy. And in fact, a lot got accomplished, and the FDA ultimately did provide an emergency use authorization for transfusion of convalescent plasma for COVID-19. But the process was extremely difficult. And in fact, ultimately, the data was pretty impoverished. And so the amount of instrumentation that we need, the amount of sort of forethought in clinical practice, so that the digital exhaust of what we can learn from that clinical practice really feeds into advancing science and ultimately regulatory approvals. Altogether, this is still, in my mind, absolutely the future, but is just much more difficult and subtle than at least I had realized, even as short as 1 year ago.
I want to add to Peter's point. I think if there's one thing we learned from COVID, it's the urgency with which we need to implement infrastructure to support real-time learning from our data. And for example, in COVID, it felt like there were so many scenarios, is proning working or not? Is early mechanical ventilation useful or not? The fact that our hospitals got full, but there were patients in the hospital where they didn't need to be there. Maybe they could have been at home. And if we had some way of using the data to identify and forecast trajectories, we could have sent these patients home and monitored them from the home setting. Alternatively, for the patients who are in the ICU, there's an opportunity to determine who's going to benefit. So I think all of that learning, there were providers who were making decisions on the fly that could have been done differently if we had real-time AI infrastructure.
Okay, there's a lot more to talk about, and many more questions that I would have liked to ask, but we have to end now. Thank you all. This has been fascinating. Thank you.
Wow, another great panel. Thank you, everybody. That was inspirational. I don't know if you're like me, but you probably are, and I'm just starstruck at everyone today and everything, all the comments that they've made and the vision for the future. It's made me very excited for what's coming next. And what's coming immediately next is another titan really in this field, and somebody I look up to, Zach Kohane, Professor and Chair of Biomedical Informatics at Harvard Medical School. We'll close this off. Zach, go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Nick. That was tremendous. What an exciting pre-symposium this has been. I hated all the ways that we had to cut off everybody about topics that we need to hear more about, whether it be from about bias versus techies underestimating the challenge to the distinction that Ken makes between what's interesting and what's impactful, to things that Maya referred to with regard to what it takes to actually evaluate how these things work, and how we can expect exciting things as many others in the panel described. So my first comment is that we need to finish this conversation. And so in that sense, to paraphrase a wish that Jews often have on Passover, I'll say, I'm looking forward to next year in Bermuda, so that you should know that, God willing, we will have an in-person meeting in the fair country of Bermuda, where we'll have the continuation of this conversation in detail with these luminaries and others. I also want to take this opportunity to thank those who made this pre-symposium possible, not least of which are our sponsors, the United Health Group, New England Journal of Medicine, and Apple Computer, our speakers and our questionnaires, the Wondrous team, and very importantly, Samantha Lemos, who made a heroic work in making this happen in record time. I would also like to note in closing, this is a recorded session. You'll be able to find all the sessions on SAIL.health, recorded with our beautiful faces featured there, and also the posters that were accepted for the symposium that actually never happened in the spring of 2020. So in the spirit of optimism, I am looking forward to a great 2021, where hopefully we can get together, because things will be so much better with global health, and we can look forward to the innovations and positive impact that artificial intelligence will have in moving health forward, and maybe even making the life of physicians better, as well as those of their patients. So thank you all. It's been a real pleasure.